The village of Blackmoor Weald did not so much end as it simply ceased. It lingered now only as a scar upon the landscape, a collection of skeletal stone cottages slumped against the relentless press of the Cumbrian moors. The year was 1889, and the place had been thus for decades, a subject of uneasy speculation in the public houses of Keswick and Penrith, but never of investigation. To look upon it was to feel a chill that had little to do with the perpetual damp. The road, once a muddy track trod by the feet of generations, was now reclaimed by knotty heather and gorse. The small church of St. Bartholomew Less stood roofless, its yew tree, a symbol of eternal life, now a black, twisted claw against the leaden sky. The churchyard was a chaos of toppled, moss-eaten headstones, the names of the departed scoured away by wind and rain, as if the earth itself sought to forget who lay beneath. A profound silence hung over the vale, broken only by the mournful cry of a curlew or the sigh of the wind through broken rafters. It was a silence that felt less like an absence of sound and more like a presence, a held breath. On one such day, when a cold mist wreathed the ruins in ghostly gray, a lone cartographer, seeking to correct an outdated ordnance survey map, ventured into the heart of the desolation. His boots sank into the soft, peaty earth with a sound like a sucking wound. He felt the weight of the place immediately, a palpable melancholy that seeped into the bones. As he picked his way past the threshold of what was once a schoolhouse, his eye caught a glint of color amidst the universal gray and green. He bent down, brushing away the clinging mud to reveal a child's wooden doll. Its paint was faded, one arm missing, but its carved smile remained, a rictus of grotesque cheer in the midst of such utter ruin. A sudden, irrational terror seized the man. It was the feeling of being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes, of having stumbled into a tomb that was not meant to be opened. He dropped the doll as if it had burned him, and turning on his heel, he fled the village without a backward glance, the meticulously drawn map in his satchel forgotten. He would later tell his colleagues in London that the place was cursed, a statement met with polite, disbelieving smiles. But in the dark of night, the memory of that sightless, smiling doll would return to him, and with it, the chilling certainty that some stories are best left buried, and some hungers are never sated. 44 years earlier, in the autumn of 1845, the village of Blackmoor Weald was yet alive, though one could be forgiven for thinking it otherwise. Life here was a tenuous thing, a hard-won struggle against the infertile soil and the creeping damp that rose from the fens. The village lay in a bowl-shaped vale, perpetually draped in a miasma of mist that rolled down from the fells, muffling sound and distorting vision. The cottages, built of rough-hewn stone and roofed with turf, seemed to grow from the earth itself, low and hunched against the elements. The people were a dour, insular lot, their faces etched by wind and worry, their piety a stark, Calvinistic brand that coexisted uneasily with older, darker superstitions. They spoke in hushed tones of the grey ladies of the moor and the will-o'-the-wisps, that led travelers to a watery grave in the bogs. Their world was small, bounded by the church, the communal well, and the grim, overarching presence of the moors. On the western edge of this community, where the cultivated patches of potato and barley gave way to the untamed wilderness of gorse and bracken, stood a solitary, dilapidated stone hut. This was the home of Alaric Grimes, the village butcher. He was a man who existed on the periphery of their society, both physically and socially. A figure of utility rather than fellowship, he was tolerated for his trade but otherwise shunned. Children were warned not to stray near his property, and mothers would cross themselves. A papist holdover their Puritan forebears would have despised, when his name was mentioned. He was old, his age a matter of speculation, his back bent like a wind-gnarled thorn tree. His hands, perpetually stained with a rusty hue, were unervingly strong and deft. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a disquieting knowledge, a glint that suggested he saw the world not as a place of souls, but as a collection of meat and bone. The villagers were poor, their diets monotonous. A stringy hen, a hare caught in a snare, or on a rare, festive occasion, a tough old ram. These were their luxuries. It was for this reason that Alaric Grimes's sausages held such a peculiar and central place in the life of the village. They were cheap, unervingly so, and were possessed of a rich, savory flavor that the meager scraps of pork and offal from the local pigs could not possibly account for. They were a staple for the poorest families, a thing to fill hungry bellies during the long, dark winters when the harvest had been meager and the game scarce. The sausages were dark, almost black in color, and heavily spiced with herbs Grimes alone gathered from the moors. They sizzled in the pan with a greasy, pungent aroma that made mouths water, a welcome warmth in a cold world. No one asked what was in them. It was better, perhaps, not to know. It was simply the way of things in Blackmoor Weald, a small, unspoken pact with the peculiar man on the edge of the moor, a pact born of necessity and shrouded in the ever-present mist. The arrival of the new curate, a young man by the name of Elias Thorne, was an event of some significance in the small, closed world of Blackmoor Weald. He came on a day in late September, the air sharp with the promise of a hard winter, the copper leaves of the beech trees clinging desperately to their branches. His approach was heralded by the sound of horses' hooves on the stony track, a sound that brought faces to windows and children to doorways, their eyes wide with a curiosity that was rare in such a weary place. Elias himself was a picture of youthful, if somewhat austere, ambition. He sat straight in the saddle of the tired-looking mare provided by the diocese, his black coat brushed but travel-stained, his collar pristine against the grimy backdrop of the veil. At 26, he possessed a countenance still unlined by the deep, particular worries of this place, his features sharp and intelligent, his eyes a clear, earnest brown that held more faith in books and reason than in the whispered fears of a superstitious peasantry. He had taken a respectable, if not brilliant, degree at Cambridge, and saw in this remote parish not a punishment, but a proving ground, a place where the light of modern thought and sincere Anglican devotion could be brought to bear against the shadows of ignorance and pagan dread. He was met at the lich gate of the church by the man he was to serve under, Parson Goodright. The parson was a man in his late 60s, tall and gaunt, his frame seeming to be little more than a scaffold for his severe black garments. His face was a collection of sharp angles and deep lines, his mouth a thin, unforgiving line, and his eyes, of a pale, watery blue, held a gravity that seemed to weigh and find wanting all they fell upon. He did not smile in greeting, but offered a bony, cold hand to Elias. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice a dry rasp, like stones grinding together deep underground. "I trust your journey was not overly arduous. We are far from the discomforts of the city here." "It was a journey of contemplation, parson," Elias replied, dismounting and shaking the proffered hand, feeling its chill even through his own gloves. "I am eager to begin my work among your flock." "My flock," Goodright repeated, his gaze sweeping over the huddled cottages as if taking inventory of a particularly disappointing stock. "A stubborn and simple people, Mr. Thorne. Their minds are clouded by the mists of this vale and by older, darker things than the wholesome fear of the Lord. Your enthusiasm is noted. See that it is tempered with prudence." He turned and began to walk towards the squat, stone vicarage without another word, leaving Elias to gather his belongings and follow, the initial warmth of his ambition slightly cooled by the man's frigid reception. The vicarage was as spare and cheerless within as its master. A pervasive dampness clung to the air, and a meager fire struggled in the large hearth, doing little to dispel the chill. Over a simple supper of boiled mutton and potatoes, Parson Goodright laid bare the stark realities of the parish. He spoke of poor harvests, of the marsh fever that took the week each autumn, and of the people's deep-seated reliance on old traditions that bordered on paganism. "They speak of the grey ladies as if they were neighbors," Goodright said, his tone dripping with contempt. "They leave offerings of milk at the standing stone on the moor to placate whatever spirits they imagine dwell there. It is a constant battle, Mr. Thorne, to keep their minds fixed on the one true God and the fiery realities of hell, when their hearts are so mired in the mud of this world and its phantom terrors. Elias, trying to maintain his optimism, ventured, "Perhaps with patient instruction, sir, and the example of a rational faith, we might lead them into the light." Goodright fixed him with a piercing stare. "Rationality is a weak flame in a place like this, boy. It is snuffed out by the first ill wind that blows from the fens. You will see." He then changed the subject, his voice taking on a more practical, yet no less grim, tone. "You will find the people peculiar in their habits. They are insular. They trust slowly. And they have a dependence on the land that you, from your comfortable college, cannot fathom. Remember that. Their survival, their very sustenance, is tied to things you may not understand." The following Sunday, Elias stood in the pulpit of St. Bartholomew the Less for the first time, assisting Parson Goodright in the morning service. The church was cold, the breath of the congregation misting in the air before their faces. They were a somber group, their heads bowed not in piety, it seemed to Elias, but in a kind of weary resignation. He looked out over the sea of gray, brown, and homespun wool, trying to meet their eyes, to offer a smile of Christian fellowship, but was met mostly with downcast gazes or expressions of blank indifference. As the service concluded and the villagers filed out, they nodded respectfully to Parson Goodright, but their eyes slid over Elias with a wariness that was palpable. It was then that he noticed it, a strange, faint odor that hung in the damp air of the church, cutting through the familiar sense of damp wool, tallow candles, and mildew. It was a coppery, slightly sweet scent, like old blood and smoked meat, with an undertone of something earthy and foul, like turned soil. He assumed it must be from the tannery down by the stream, whose operations he had been told were a necessary, if malodorous, part of the village's economy. Later, as he stood at the church door, he attempted to greet his new parishioners. Most offered mumbled pleasantries and hurried on their way. But one woman lingered at the edge of the churchyard, her thin shawl pulled tight around her shoulders despite the chill. She was perhaps in her middle years, but a life of hardship had carved decades more onto her face. Her eyes, large and dark in their sunken sockets, were fixed on him with an intensity that was disquieting. This was Martha Clay. As Elias approached, she did not wait for him to speak. Her voice was a low, urgent whisper, like the rustle of dead leaves. "You are the new man," she stated, her eyes darting around as if fearing they might be overheard. "I am Elias Thorne. I hope to be of service to you, Mrs. Clay," she said, ignoring his offered hand. "Martha Clay. You smell it, don't you? The scent on the air." Elias, slightly taken aback, nodded. "The tannery, I presume. A necessary evil for the village's trade." A bitter, mirthless smile touched her lips. "Aye, that's what they say. The tannery. Or the mist from the fens. They have a name for everything, a reason for everything." She leaned closer, and he could smell the faint scent of poverty and dried herbs on her clothes. "But you mark me, Reverend Thorne. That is not the smell of a tannery. That is the smell of this place. The smell of the earth here. It does not give up its dead. It gives them back." With that cryptic and chilling warning, she turned and shuffled away, melting into the gray landscape as if she were a part of it, leaving Elias with a cold knot of unease tightening in his stomach, the rational explanations he had clung to suddenly feeling very thin and very fragile indeed. The memory of Martha Clay's words and the peculiar, pervasive odor lingered with Elias Thorne throughout the following week, a dissonant counterpoint to the quiet rhythms of his new life. He attempted to lose himself in the study of the parish records, in the preparation of his first sermon, and in long, solitary walks along the edges of the cultivated land, but the Vale's oppressive atmosphere clung to him like the ever-present damp. The conviction grew within him that to understand his flock, he must first understand the sources of their peculiar dread. And the figure of Alaric Grimes, the reclusive butcher, loomed largest in the villagers' whispered mythology. It was a matter of pastoral duty, he told himself, to confront this spectre, to demystify the man and, in doing so, perhaps weaken the hold of the superstitions that surrounded him. On a Tuesday morning, with a sky the color of bruised slate threatening rain, Elias made his way towards the western edge of the village. The path to Grimes's property was little more than a sheep track, muddy and neglected. The cottages grew more widely spaced, then ceased altogether, and the land rose sharply into the wild, open moors. The butcher's dwelling was exactly as described, a low, stone hovel built into the lee of a small hill, its roof a thick mat of turf from which patches of yellowed grass grew. A thin, constant plume of gray smoke rose from a crude stone chimney, and behind the hut stood a smaller, windowless stone building, the smokehouse, from which the same coppery, smoky scent he had noticed in the church emanated with a far greater potency. As he approached, the silence was broken not by the expected sounds of livestock, but by the steady, rhythmic thock, thock, thock of a cleaver. The door to the hovel was open, revealing a cavernous interior dark with shadows and soot. Elias rapped his knuckles against the doorframe, the sound swallowed by the thick stone. The chopping stopped. From the darkness within, a figure emerged, resolving itself slowly in the weak daylight. Alaric Grimes was even more unsettling at close quarters. He was shorter than Elias had imagined, but his shoulders were broad and powerful beneath a stained leather apron. His face was a web of deep fissures, his nose a hooked beak, and his thinning hair the color of old ash. But it was his eyes that commanded attention. They were a pale, milky blue, almost colorless, and seemed to see not just the surface of a man, but through him, to the meat and bone beneath. Yes. The word was a dry croak. "Mr. Grimes? I am Elias Thorne, the new curate," Elias began, forcing a tone of polite authority. "I am making the acquaintance of all my parishioners." Grimes's lips stretched into a slow, thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "Parishioners," he repeated, as if tasting a strange word. "I've seen you from a distance. A young one. City-bred." He wiped his hands on his apron, leaving fresh, dark smears on the worn leather. The hands themselves were a horror, gnarled, powerful, the knuckles swollen, the nails blackened and thick, the skin permanently stained a deep, rusty brown. "You'll be wanting to see the operation then." "Most do, sooner or later." He stepped back, gesturing for Elias to enter. The interior of the hut was a single room, a combination of living space and abattoir. The air was thick and hot, heavy with the cloying, metallic smell of fresh blood and the pungent aroma of the herbs that hung in dried bunches from the low ceiling. Sage, thyme, and others Elias could not name. In the center of the room was a massive, scarred wooden block, dark and deeply stained, upon which lay the source of the recent chopping, a large, unrecognizable piece of dark meat, threaded with sinew and glistening with moisture. Various knives, saws, and cleavers, all frighteningly sharp, hung from hooks on the wall, gleaming dully in the firelight. There was no furniture to speak of, only a rough pallet in one corner and the large, soot-blackened hearth where a cauldron simmered, giving off a rich, meaty steam. "A humble trade," Grimes said, watching Elias's face take in the scene. "But a necessary one. The people of the Weald, they need their strength. Especially with winter coming." He moved to a shelf where several long, coiled strings of sausages hung, their skins a dark, ruddy brown, almost black. "My speciality. A secret recipe. Herbs from the high moors, parts others would waste. It binds the community, you see. Gives them strength from the land itself." He took down one of the strings. The sausages were thick, heavy-looking, and the spicy, smoky scent that came from them was undeniably rich, yet to Elias, in this place, it was utterly nauseating. "A gift," Grimes said, thrusting the coiled links towards Elias. "For the new shepherd. To fortify you for your work among this stubborn flock." Elias's stomach turned. The offer felt less like a gesture of welcome and more like a test, a demand for complicity. The image of the cleaver, the sight of the stained block, the overpowering stench of blood and unknown spices, and the butcher's knowing, milky gaze all converged into a wave of primal revulsion. To accept this gift felt like accepting a part of this dark, bloody world, of sanctioning whatever unspoken things happened in this hut on the edge of the moors. He took a half-step back, his hands remaining at his sides. "You are most kind, Mr. Grimes," he said, his voice tighter than he intended. "But I must decline. I have taken a vow of dietary abstinence. For spiritual clarity, I partake only of bread, vegetables, and water." For a long moment, Grimes said nothing. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the slow, steady drip of something from the table into a bucket on the floor. The smile on the old man's face did not fade, but it seemed to harden, to become something colder and more calculating. The pale eyes seemed to look right through Elias's polite fiction. "A vow," Grimes repeated softly, the word hanging in the thick air. "Spiritual clarity. I see." He lowered the sausages, his gaze never leaving Elias's face. "The body has its own needs, Reverend. It hungers. Deny it too long, and it will find its own sustenance. It will feast on itself, or on other things." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Very well. Keep your vow. But remember, the strength of the shepherd must match the peculiarities of the sheep. You may find you have need of more than bread and water before the winter is out." The implied threat, or perhaps it was merely a statement of grim fact, hung in the air between them. Elias murmured a hurried farewell, his pastoral mission utterly forgotten, and stumbled back out into the cold, damp air. He drew deep breaths, trying to cleanse his lungs of the hut's foul atmosphere, but the cloying, spicy scent of the sausages seemed to have followed him, a phantom odor that clung to his clothes and his memory. He had gone to demystify a superstition and had instead encountered something far more tangible and far more unsettling. A presence of such visceral, unsettling reality that it made the villagers' fears of grey ladies and will-o'-the-wisps seem like childish fancies. Alaric Grimes was no phantom. He was a man of flesh and blood and stained hands, and the dread he inspired was as real and as sharp as the cleaver he wielded. The encounter with Alaric Grimes left Elias Thorne in a state of profound disquiet. The rational foundations upon which he had built his worldview, the supremacy of Scripture, the power of reasoned argument, the essential order of God's creation, felt suddenly unsound, as if the peat beneath Blackmoor Weald was not solid ground but a quaking bog. He tried to dismiss the butcher's words as the ramblings of a lonely, half-mad old man, and his own revulsion as a product of a sheltered sensibility. Yet, the memory of that milky, knowing gaze and the oppressive atmosphere of the blood-soaked hut refused to be banished. It was with a heavy heart that he threw himself into his duties, seeking solace in the familiar rituals of his faith. It was a mere fortnight after his visit to the edge of the moors that the first shadow fell. The subject was John Harlow, a farmer known throughout the Vale for his robust constitution and cheerful disposition. A man in the prime of his life, with a strong back and a laugh that could echo across a field, he was the very picture of rural vitality. The news, therefore, that John Harlow had taken to his bed with a sudden, violent fever, sent a ripple of alarm through the community. Elias heard the whispers at the communal well and saw the anxious looks exchanged between the women as they did their washing. He determined to make a visit, to offer spiritual comfort, and he privately hoped to witness an illness that would prove to be mundane, a simple ague that would restore his sense of a predictable world. The Harlow cottage was a scene of grim despair. The air within was thick with the smell of sweat and the pungent aroma of poultices simmering on the hearth. John's wife, Eleanor, a normally sturdy woman, looked gaunt and hollow-eyed, her hands wringing a damp cloth incessantly. She led Elias to the bedside where John lay, and the sight struck a chill into the curate's soul. The man was utterly transformed. His robust frame seemed to have collapsed in upon itself, the flesh hanging loose on his bones. His skin was the color of tallow, slick with a clammy perspiration, and his breathing was a ragged, shallow effort. But it was his eyes that were the most horrifying, wide, staring, and blazing with a febrile terror that saw nothing in the room but some internal horror. Dr. Trefoil, the village physician, a weary man with bags under his eyes that spoke of a lifetime of fighting losing battles against the maladies of the moor, was packing his bag. He met Elias's gaze and gave a slight, hopeless shake of his head. "It is a wasting sickness," the doctor murmured, drawing Elias aside. "I have seen its like before, though never so swift or so severe. It consumes a man from the inside out. There is no fever in the blood I can bleed, no humor I can balance. It is as if his very vitality is being devoured." As if on cue, John Harlow stirred. A low moan escaped his lips, which twisted into a grimace of utter revulsion. "The gravy," he slurred, his voice a dry rustle. "Oh, the gravy at the supper, it was foul. I tasted it. I tasted old Mr. Miller in it. I swear it on my soul." Eleanor rushed to his side, her face a mask of confusion and fear. "Hush, John, hush now. That was weeks ago. It was just the stew." But John was lost in his delirium, his head thrashing on the sweat-soaked pillow. His hand, the missing finger. "I tasted the salt of it. And the smoke from Grimes's house. It's not wood, Eleanor, it's never been wood." His voice rose to a terrified shriek. "The dead are not at rest. They walk in Grimes's smokehouse. I've seen them. Their faces in the smoke." A profound silence fell over the room, broken only by the sick man's ragged breaths. Eleanor stared at her husband, her face ashen. Dr. Trefoil looked down at his feet, a muscle working in his jaw. Elias felt the cold knot in his stomach tighten into a fist of ice. The ravings of a fever were one thing. The specific, grotesque detail of tasting old Mr. Miller, a village elder who had passed the previous winter, was another altogether. It was a coincidence, a horrible, meaningless coincidence born of delirium, he told himself fiercely. It had to be. He offered a prayer, the words feeling hollow and inadequate in the face of such tangible horror, and took his leave. As he walked back to the vicarage through the gathering dusk, the village seemed changed. The mist coiling between the cottages no longer seemed merely damp, it felt watchful. The lighted windows were not beacons of warmth, but eyes staring out from a place of dark secrets. John Harlow's delirious accusations echoed in his mind, intertwining with Martha Clay's warning and the unsettling presence of Alaric Grimes. The dead are not at rest. It was the raving of a sick man. It had to be. But as Elias closed the door of the vicarage behind him, shutting out the gloom of the vale, he could not shut out the chilling thought that John Harlow, in his fever, was not raving at all, but was the only one in Blackmoor Weald who could see the terrible, unvarnished truth. The following morning, a solemn-faced boy arrived at the vicarage with a message from Dr. Trefoil. John Harlow had passed in the night. The first thread in the fragile tapestry of the village had been pulled, and the entire weave was beginning to unravel. The death of John Harlow cast a long, palpable shadow over Blackmoor Weald. It was not merely the loss of a man, but the shattering of an illusion, the illusion of safety, of health, in a place where both were perpetually precarious. A grim anxiety settled upon the village, as thick and suffocating as the autumn fogs. Whispers filled the narrow lanes, no longer just about grey ladies, but about a new, more intimate terror. The Harlow sickness, they called it, a plague that struck without warning and consumed from within. Dr. Trefoil, cornered by a group of worried men outside the smithy, could only shrug his stooped shoulders and speak of miasmas rising from the fens, of bad air and ill humors. His explanations sounded hollow, even to his own ears, and did nothing to calm the rising tide of fear. It was in this atmosphere of dread that Parson Goodright determined to make a stand. The harvest supper, a tradition meant to give thanks for God's bounty and fortify the community for the trials of winter, would proceed as planned. He announced it from the pulpit the Sunday after Harlow's burial, his voice cutting through the funereal silence of the congregation. "We shall not let the shadow of death extinguish the light of our fellowship," he thundered, his bony fist striking the lectern. "We will gather and we will feast, and we will show that in unity and in faith there is strength against the darkness." To Elias, sitting in his curate's chair, the sentiment felt forced, a performance of resilience that rang false against the genuine, bewildered grief on the faces of the parishioners. The supper was held in the largest communal space available, the tithe barn. Its high, timbered roof was lost in shadow, and the chill of the evening seeped through the gaps in the stone walls. Long trestle tables had been set up, lit by guttering tallow candles that threw dancing, monstrous shapes upon the walls. The air, initially crisp, was soon thick with the smell of damp wool, wood smoke, and the steam from a single, massive tureen of stew that sat at the head of the table. Parson Goodright, presiding over the gathering with a stern countenance, offered a lengthy grace that spoke more of God's wrath than his mercy. Then, as the Amen echoed feebly in the vast space, he lifted the ladle. "The Lord provides," he intoned, his eyes scanning the hungry, anxious faces before him. "And in his wisdom, and through the charity of a loyal member of our flock, we have a feast to sustain us. A hearty stew, made with the finest provisions from Alaric Grimes's larder." Elias, seated to the parson's right, felt a cold jolt of recognition. He watched as the ladle plunged into the dark, rich broth, emerging laden with chunks of meat and vegetables. He saw the strings of sliced, dark sausages, their distinctive spicy aroma now filling the barn, mingling unervingly with the scent of the steam. As the bowls were filled and passed down the table, a change came over the people. The initial tension seemed to break, replaced by a frantic, almost desperate hunger. The sound of spoons scraping against wooden bowls and the appreciative murmurs of the villagers filled the barn. They ate with a gusto that bordered on the savage, their fears momentarily forgotten in the primal satisfaction of a hot, flavorful meal. Children, their faces smeared with gravy, asked for second helpings. Elias alone sat before a full bowl, his hands clenched in his lap. The stew, once so inviting in its concept, now seemed a grotesque parody of sustenance. The chunks of dark meat, the slices of the distinctive sausage, they were a physical manifestation of the village's secret sickness, a sickness he now suspected was far more literal than any miasma. He could not bring himself to lift the spoon. He saw the eager, grateful faces of his parishioners, and a wave of nausea, part revulsion, part profound pity, washed over him. They were consuming their own fear, swallowing the very source of the curse that hung over them, and calling it charity. His eyes scanned the room, and he found her. Martha Clay. She sat at the far end of one of the tables, her bowl untouched before her. She was not looking at her food, but at the faces of her neighbors as they ate, her expression one of pure, unadulterated horror. It was the look of a woman watching her loved ones drink from a poisoned well, knowing she was powerless to stop them. Her gaze then lifted and met Elias's across the smoky, crowded room. In that moment, a silent, terrible understanding passed between them. They were the only two in the entire barn who were not partaking in this unholy communion. When the feast was done, and the villagers, their bellies full and their spirits artificially lifted, began to disperse into the night, Elias made his way through the crowd towards her. She saw him coming and shrank back as if fearing the contact. "Mrs. Clay," Elias began, his voice low. "You did not eat." She shook her head, her eyes wide and glistening in the candlelight. "I have broken bread with death before, Reverend Thorne. I shall not do it again." She clutched at his sleeve, her grip surprisingly strong. "You saw them. You saw how they hungered for it. It is not natural. It is a hunger that he puts in them. The sickness, it only takes those who have partaken. My husband, my two boys, after the feast following the great flood, when Grimes's meat was all there was to eat. They wasted away, just like John Harlow. They cried out in the night about tasting their neighbors." Her voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "It is not a sickness of the body, sir. It is a sickness of the soul, passed through the flesh. Mark my words, Reverend. In a week's time, the bell will toll again. It always does after a feast. She released his arm and melted away into the darkness outside the barn, leaving Elias alone with the greasy smell of the feast and the chilling certainty that her prophecy would come true. He looked back at the empty tables, at the discarded bowls with their film of congealing, dark gravy, and felt the weight of the secret he now carried. It was no longer just a suspicion, it was a dreadful, burgeoning knowledge, and the burden of it felt like a stone upon his heart. The Feast of Shadows was over, and the long, dark fast of truth had begun. The harvest supper, intended as a bulwark against despair, had instead become its engine. Martha Clay's prophecy hung over Elias Thorne like the sword of Damocles, a ticking clock of dread measured not in hours, but in the failing health of his parishioners. He moved through the following days in a state of heightened vigilance, his every sense attuned to the slightest sign of illness. Each cough heard from an open doorway, each pale face encountered at the well, sent a fresh jolt of alarm through him. The village, sated and temporarily cheerful in the supper's aftermath, seemed to him a flock grazing unknowingly on poison pasture. He could not confront Parson Goodright again without more than whispers and the ravings of a dying man. He needed evidence. Cold, hard, undeniable facts. And he knew of only one repository of the village's history, the vestry of St. Bartholomew the Less. The vestry was a small, windowless room off the chancel, colder even than the church itself, its air stale and thick with the smell of old paper and slow decay. Towering shelves were crammed with ledgers, their leather bindings cracked and furred with dust. Here was the mundane scripture of Blackmoor Weald, the births, marriages, and deaths recorded in the spidery, ink-faded hands of his predecessors. It was a daunting task, but Elias, armed with a desperate purpose and a single tallow candle, began his grim archaeology. He started with the most recent ledger, working his way backwards from John Harlowe's entry. The pattern, once he knew to look for it, began to emerge with chilling clarity. The summer had been unremarkable. Then, the harvest supper was noted in a marginal scrawl by Parson Goodright. Provided a fine feast for the community, thanks be to God and the charity of A.G. A week later, the first entry appeared, John Harlowe of a wasting fever. God have mercy on his soul. Then another and another. A farmer named Evans, a young wife named Cooper, a laborer named Smith. All struck by the same inexplicable, swift decline. All had been at the supper. His hands trembling slightly, Elias pulled ledgers from further back. The winter of 1838-39 was harsh. The record spoke of a great scarcity. An entry from January 1839 caught his eye. Alaric Grimes, a true Christian indeed, hath supplied meat for the pot of the needy throughout this trial. And following that act of charity, in the spring of 1839, a cluster of deaths from a persistent contagion. He went back further, to 1832. A flood had inundated the lower cottages. The record noted, the stores of many ruined. A.G. provided sustenance from his own stores to prevent starvation. And that summer, another fever had carried off a dozen souls, Martha Clay's family among them. It was not a coincidence. It was a cycle. A gruesome, unholy cycle. A period of hardship, an intervention by Alaric Grimes, and then, weeks or months later, a mysterious culling of the very people he had supposedly saved. The village's survival was being purchased with its own lives, a monstrous tithe paid in flesh and blood. The Harlowe sickness was not a sickness at all. It was a consequence. His heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, Elias reached for the oldest ledger he could find, its binding brittle, its pages foxed with brown spots like dried blood. It was from the turn of the century, the hand a formal, copperplate script. He scanned the entries, his eyes straining in the poor light. And then he found it. In the year of our Lord 1801, a note of a different nature entirely. It was not a record of a birth or death, but a personal memorandum, squeezed into the margin beside a list of burials. The handwriting was agitated, the letters slanting wildly, as if written in a state of high agitation. "I have looked upon the face of the abomination this night," it began. "The rumors that dog the man Grimes are not the fancies of simple minds. I followed him, saw him at his grisly work in the old section of the yard, where the unblessed and the paupers lie. He does not rob graves for the surgeons. His purpose is far darker. He butchers what he unearths and hangs the meat in his smokehouse to cure. I confronted him, and he did not deny it. He smiled his ghastly smile and said, 'The living must eat, and the dead must serve. It is the oldest law of this weald. I am undone by this knowledge. I cannot give this foul meat to my flock. But to reveal the truth would be to destroy them utterly. What is my duty? God seems to have abandoned me to this hellish choice. I fear he knows that I know. I fear I shall not.'" The entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence. The following page was the start of a new year, in a different, calmer hand. A brief, formal note stated that the previous curate, the author of the frantic margin note, had vanished one night in the winter of 1801, presumed to have fallen prey to wolves or the treacherous bogs while walking abroad. Elias leaned back in the hard wooden chair, the ledger falling from his numb fingers onto the desk with a soft thud that echoed like a tomb door closing in the silent room. The candle flame guttered, casting frantic shadows. There was no more doubt. No room for rationalization. The horror was real, documented, and stretched back decades. A secret passed down through the generations, a pact with a devil who wore the face of a butcher. The previous curate had discovered the truth and had been silenced. Elias now held the same terrible knowledge. The weight of it was crushing, a physical pressure on his chest. He was no longer an observer, a curious newcomer. He was now a part of the terrible, hidden history of Blackmoor Weald, and the same darkness that had swallowed his predecessor now waited, patient and hungry, for him. The words from the ledger seemed to have burned themselves onto the back of Elias's eyes. He saw them when he closed his lids to sleep, the frantic, slanting script swimming in the darkness. "I have looked upon the face of the abomination. I fear I shall not." The silence of the vicarage, once a respite, now felt like the quiet of a tomb. Every creak of a floorboard, every rattle of a window pane, was the footstep of the vanished curate, a ghostly warning. He had become the inheritor of a terrible secret, a secret that had already proven fatal. The rational world of Cambridge, of theological debate and orderly devotion, had shriveled to a meaningless pinpoint of light, extinguished by the overwhelming primeval darkness of the Weald. He could not go to Parson Goodright. The parson's reaction to his initial, tentative suspicions had made it clear he was not an ally, but a guardian of the status quo, a shepherd who fed his flock from a charnel house. To confide in him would be to invite another lecture on necessary evils, or worse, to share the fate of the ledger's author. No, Elias was alone with this knowledge, and the burden of it was a canker in his soul, festering and spreading. He knew, with a certainty that chilled his blood, that he could not simply hold the knowledge. He had to see. He had to witness the atrocity with his own eyes, to sear the reality of it upon his mind so that no power of reason or persuasion could ever allow him to doubt it again. He had to look upon the face of the abomination. The decision made, a strange calm settled over him. It was the calm of desperation, of a man stepping off a precipice. He waited until the deep of night, when the moon was a sliver of bone behind racing, tattered clouds, and the wind moaned a dirge through the chinks in the stone walls. Dressing in his darkest clothes, he slipped from the vicarage like a thief, the biting air a shock that sharpened his senses. The village was a collection of huddled, sleeping forms, no light showing in any window. He felt 1,000 times more exposed than in the bright light of day, every shadow a potential witness, every rustle in the hedgerow a signal of his approach. He did not take the path, but cut across the fields, his boots sinking into the soft, wet earth, the cold seeping through the leather. The journey to Alaric Grimes's property, which had felt long in daylight, now seemed an eternity, a pilgrimage through a landscape of nightmare. The gorse bushes clawed at his trousers, and once, an owl's shriek directly overhead nearly stopped his heart. He finally reached the copse of stunted, wind-driven trees that overlooked the butcher's hut, the same vantage point from which he had spied weeks before. Crouching behind a thick trunk, his breath pluming in the frigid air, he settled in to wait. For over an hour, nothing moved but the clouds and the shadows they cast upon the moors. The hut was dark, the smokehouse a solid block of deeper blackness against the night. Doubt began to gnaw at him. Perhaps the ledger was wrong. Perhaps the previous curate had been mad. Perhaps he, Elias, was now the mad one, lurking in the cold based on the ravings of a fever victim and a century-old scrap of paper. Then a sound. The soft, grating scrape of wood on stone. A sliver of jaundiced light appeared as the door to the hut opened. The figure of Alaric Grimes emerged, a dark lantern in his hand. Its shutter opened just enough to cast a feeble beam upon the ground before his feet. He was not dressed for bed, but wore his stained leather apron. In his other hand he carried not a farmer's tool, but a long-handled, wicked-looking spade. He did not pause or look around, but set off with a purposeful, trudging gait, not towards the moors or any imaginary pig pen, but unmistakably, inevitably, in the direction of the churchyard. A cold that had nothing to do with the night air seized Elias. This was it, the confirmation. His limbs felt leaden, but he forced himself to move, flitting from tree to shadowy tree, keeping the bobbing pinpoint of Grimes's lantern always in sight. The journey to the churchyard was a blur of terror. The old lich gate groaned as Grimes pushed through it, a sound like a dying man's sigh. Elias did not follow through the gate, but instead crept along the low stone wall that encircled the consecrated ground, his heart hammering against his ribs so violently he feared the old man would hear it. Grimes moved with the familiarity of long practice. He passed by the neat rows of newer headstones, the final resting places of the village's recent, properly buried dead. He walked on, towards the far northern corner of the yard, a neglected, sunken area where the ground was uneven and the markers, if they existed at all, were mere rough-hewn rocks. This was the pauper's field, the place where the unblessed, the suicides, the stillborn, and the nameless wanderers were interred in shallow, unconsecrated ground. The place the ledger had mentioned. Elias watched, his hands gripping the cold, damp stone of the wall until his knuckles ached. Grimes set the lantern down, its light illuminating a patch of freshly turned earth, a grave so new it had not yet settled. With a practiced efficiency that was more horrifying than any show of malice, the old butcher set the blade of his spade to the earth and began to dig. The sound was a soft, rhythmic thud, crunch, as the metal bit into the soil and peat. There was no reverence, no hesitation, only the grim, practical motion of a man harvesting a crop. He did not dig for long. Soon, the spade struck something hollow. Grimes worked more carefully then, clearing the soil away from the object. Finally, he bent down and, with a grunt of effort, hauled a long, roughly sewn shroud from the earth. It was heavy, sagging in the middle. He dragged it unceremoniously onto the grass beside the grave. Then he reached back into the hole and retrieved a second, smaller bundle. A child's shroud. Elias turned away, his stomach heaving, though nothing came up. He had seen enough. More than enough. The intellectual horror of the ledger was now a visceral, physical reality. He heard the sound of the shrouds being loaded into a wheelbarrow he had not noticed before, the crunch of the wheels on the gravel path. He did not wait to see more. Sliding down the outside of the wall into the damp bracken, he lay there for a long time, trembling uncontrollably. The images of the violated grave and the two shrouded forms burned into his mind forever. The abomination was no longer a story. It was a man with a spade, and his work was not yet done for the night. And Elias, alone in the crushing darkness, knew he was the only soul in Blackmoor Weald who knew it. A profound sickness of the soul settled upon Elias Thorne as he stumbled back through the benighted veil, a sickness no prayer could cleanse. The world had been rendered alien, its familiar shapes, the outline of a cottage against the sky, the sound of the wind in the eaves, now masking an unspeakable horror. The cold, damp air he drew into his lungs felt contaminated, tainted by the knowledge of what was, at that very moment, being transported back to the hut on the hill. He saw it all in his mind's eye with dreadful clarity, the rough-woven shrouds, dark with damp earth, lying in the wheelbarrow, the deliberate, unhurried pace of Alaric Grimes as he pushed his grisly harvest towards his workshop, the pale, knowing eyes that would be glinting in the lantern light, devoid of anything resembling human remorse. He found himself not at the vicarage door, but standing once more at the edge of the copse of trees overlooking Grimes's property. A compulsive, masochistic drive had taken hold of him. The exhumation was only the beginning of the profanity. The ledger had spoken of the smokehouse, the final, blasphemous temple where the dead were transformed into provender. He had to see it. He had to bear witness to the entire hideous process, to sear the full extent of the truth upon his consciousness so that he could never again doubt, never again seek a rational explanation. He had to look upon the heart of the darkness. The property was silent now, the wheelbarrow parked beside the door of the main hut. A faint glow emanated from within, suggesting the old man was at his work. The smaller, windowless stone building, the smokehouse, stood a dozen yards away, a squat, ominous silhouette. Its very lack of features was menacing. It was a place designed to keep secrets. A thin, almost invisible wisp of vapor, not the hearty smoke of a wood fire, but a greasy, pallid haze, seeped from a crack near its stone slab roof, carrying with it that now familiar, cloying scent, spices doing a poor, desperate job of masking the underlying stench of curing meat. Summoning a courage he did not feel, Elias left the cover of the trees and crept towards the outbuilding. The ground was soft and muffled his footsteps. The world seemed to hold its breath. As he drew closer, the smell intensified, a physical presence that coated the back of his throat. It was a symphony of corruption disguised as sustenance, the heavy, pungent aroma of sage and juniper berry wrestling with the thick, metallic tang of blood and the primal, unsettling odor of rendered human fat. It was the smell of the harvest supper, the smell that lingered in the church, the smell of Blackmoor Weald itself. The smokehouse door was a heavy, ill-fitting thing of warped oak, secured by a simple but stout iron latch. He dared not try it, for fear the sound would alert the butcher. Instead, he ran his fingers along the rough stone until he found what he was searching for, a gap between two ill-laid stones, no wider than his thumb, level with his eyes. He leaned forward, pressing his face against the cold, damp stone, and peered inside. For a moment, his eyes, adjusted to the gloom, could make out little. The interior was filled with a dense, shifting haze, the source of which was a smoldering pile of peat and green wood in a central pit, giving off more stifling vapor than clear heat. Then, as his vision adjusted, the shapes within the smoke began to resolve. They hung from the blackened, low-hanging rafters on iron hooks, swaying almost imperceptibly in the sluggish, heated air. They were not the familiar, symmetrical sides of pork or beef. These were longer, leaner, with a different, more terrible architecture of bone and sinew. A leg, pale and streaked with yellow fat, terminated in a foot that was unmistakably, horrifyingly human, though the toes had been neatly removed. A torso, split open down the sternum, its cavity empty and smoked to a dull, leathery brown. Arms, bereft of hands, hung like grotesque pendulums. And there, smaller and more heartbreaking, were the smaller forms, the limbs of a child, their size and proportions speaking a silent, screaming testament to the source of Grimes's special blend. His gaze swept the dreadful inventory, and it fell upon a hook near the door, upon which a freshly skinned, recognizable human head had been impaled, its features blurred by the removal of skin and hair, the mouth agape in a silent, eternal scream. It was the final, unbearable detail. This was no longer a matter of anonymous meat. This was the butchery of persons, of souls who had lived and breathed in this very village. Stumbling back from the wall, Elias doubled over, his body convulsing as he vomited into the bracken, the sparse contents of his stomach offering no relief. The physical act was a feeble, inadequate response to the psychological violation he had just endured. He had seen the truth, the raw, unvarnished engine of the village's cursed existence. The whispers, the sickness, the ledger, it all coalesced into this one, foul-smelling, smoke-choked stone room. This was the source. This was the fount from which the poison flowed, the altar upon which the community's survival was purchased with the coin of its own dead. He fled. He did not look back. He ran through the darkness, the image of the smokehouse interior burned onto his retina, the taste of the vile smoke and his own bile filling his mouth. He burst into the vicarage, locking the door behind him as if the horror itself were at his heels. He collapsed before the cold hearth, his body shaking uncontrollably. The last vestiges of his old world were gone. He was no longer a man of God in a fallen world. He was a witness to a hell on earth, and the knowledge was a fire in his veins, demanding action, screaming for revelation. But to whom could he reveal it? And what would be left of Blackmoor Weald when he did? The burden was now absolute, and it felt heavy enough to crush him into the very earth from which the dead were so cruelly taken. The dawn that crept into the vicarage brought no comfort, only a cruel, grey light that exposed the shabbiness of his surroundings and the profound alteration within his own soul. Elias Thorne had not slept. He sat in the same chair by the dead hearth, his body leaden, his mind a churning maelstrom of the images he had witnessed. The violated grave, the shrouded forms, the smokehouse with its ghastly, swaying contents. These visions played behind his eyes on a relentless, hellish loop. The physical act of vomiting had been a mere spasm, a bodily reflex utterly inadequate to purge the metaphysical filth that now coated his spirit. He felt defiled, as if the greasy, sanguine smoke from that accursed building had permeated his very being. In the stark clarity of his horror, the final, dreadful pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with an almost audible snap. The Harlow sickness was not a sickness at all. It was a poisoning, a slow, cumulative desecration. The villagers were not merely eating meat, they were consuming the physical essence of their own kin, their neighbors, their friends. They were ingesting death itself, and their bodies, in some primal, unknowable way, were rebelling against this ultimate taboo. John Harlow's delirious cry, "I tasted old Mr. Miller," was not the raving of a fevered brain, but a horrific, literal truth. His system had recognized, on some cellular level, the familiar substance it was being forced to assimilate. The wasting was not a disease, but a collapse, a soul-deep rejection of a sustenance that was an abomination in the eyes of both God and nature. He saw now the full, monstrous architecture of the secret that sustained Blackmoor Weald. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of damnation. A poor harvest or a harsh winter would lead to scarcity. Alaric Grimes, the village's monstrous benefactor, would provide his cheap, flavorful sausages and meats, staving off outright starvation. Then, weeks or months later, a fever, or wasting sickness, would cull the population, providing Grimes with a fresh supply of raw materials for his larder from the newly filled graves. The village's survival was a ghoulish equation, a balance sheet written in blood and tallied in flesh. The strong, for a time, were fed by the weak, until they themselves succumbed and became food for the next generation of the strong. It was a perversion of the sacrament, a communion of the damned, where the body and blood were not symbolic, but gruesomely, literally, their own. A fresh, more personal wave of revulsion washed over him as he thought of Parson Goodright. The parson's grim resignation during their previous conversation now took on a new and terrifying significance. It was not the resignation of a man battling superstition, but of a man who knew the terrible, practical truth and had made his peace with it. He had stood at the pulpit, quoting scripture, while knowingly shepherding his flock towards a feast of their own dead. He had blessed the bowls of stew, had presided over the consumption of this unholy sacrifice. Was he a captive of this horror, or its high priest? The line, in Elias's mind, had become terrifyingly blurred. The burden of this knowledge was no longer just a weight. It was an active, corrosive force. To remain silent was to be complicit. It was to become a part of the machine, another cog in the grinding, monstrous engine that kept Blackmoor Weald functioning in its state of living damnation. Every day he said nothing, another family might be partaking of the butcher's gifts, another soul might be unknowingly sealing their own terrible fate. Yet, to speak was to unleash a cataclysm. To stand before the congregation and reveal that the sustenance they had relied upon for generations, the food that had filled their children's bellies, was the rendered flesh of their own grandparents, parents, and children. It would not be a revelation. It would be an annihilation. It would shatter every mind that comprehended it. It would turn husbands against wives, parents against children, as they realized what they had fed each other. The village would not survive the truth. It would descend into madness, violence, and suicide. He was trapped in a theologian's nightmare, an ethical dilemma with no righteous path. Was it a greater sin to allow this abomination to continue for the sake of temporal survival, or to expose it and destroy every soul in the process? His faith offered no clear answer. The Bible spoke of truth setting one free, but here, the truth promised only a freedom into insanity and despair. He thought of Martha Clay's hollow eyes, of her lonely, terrible knowledge. She had chosen silence to preserve her own sanity, becoming a ghost among the living. Could he do the same? Could he live out his days in this veil, performing the rites of a god who seemed to have abandoned this place, all the while knowing what simmered in the pots and hung in the smokehouse? He stood and walked to the small, leaded window, looking out at the mist-shrouded village. The people were beginning to stir. He saw a woman hanging washing, a man leading a cow to pasture. They were going about the simple, timeless routines of life, utterly unaware that the very foundation of their world was a charnel pit. He felt a vast, unbearable pity for them, a pity so intense it was akin to physical pain. They were victims, every one of them, trapped in a cycle they did not understand, fed a lie that was literally consuming them from the inside out. And he, Elias Thorne, was now the sole bearer of the terrible truth that could either continue their damned existence or end it in a storm of fire and blood. The horrid revelation was complete, and it had left him utterly, terribly alone. A fever of resolve, born of despair and revulsion, gripped Elias. He could not contain this knowledge within the confines of his own skull any longer. It was a poison that would surely drive him mad if he did not share its burden. He could not go to the villagers. That way lay only chaos and the sword. There was only one man in Blackmoor Weald who held any semblance of authority, one man who might, however improbably, provide a path through this nightmare. He must confront Parson Goodright. He must look into the eyes of his superior and demand to know how deep the complicity ran, and what, in the name of God, they were to do. He found the parson in his study, a room even more austere and joyless than the rest of the vicarage. Goodright was seated at a massive oak desk, scrutinizing a ledger of tithes, his spectacles perched on the end of his thin nose. He did not look up as Elias entered, but merely gestured with a skeletal hand for him to wait. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the scratch of the quill and the ticking of a long case clock in the corner, its pendulum swinging like the beat of a dead heart. Finally, Elias could bear it no longer. "Parson," he began, his voice rough and unsteady, "I must speak with you. On a matter of the gravest urgency." Goodright finished his notation with a slow, deliberate stroke, then carefully set his quill in its rest. He removed his spectacles and fixed his pale, watery eyes on Elias. "Urgency is a constant state in this parish, Mr. Thorne. What new phantasm has troubled your sleep?" "It is no phantasm, sir." Elias stepped forward, his hands clenched at his sides. I have seen it. With my own eyes. I know the truth about Alaric Grimes. I know the source of his meat. The change in the parson's countenance was subtle, but to Elias, who was watching with the intensity of a hawk, it was as dramatic as a thunderclap. There was no shock, no disbelief, no righteous anger. Instead, a profound weariness seemed to settle deeper into the lines of his face. The stern mask did not crack, but it seemed to grow heavier, as if carved from stone. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in protest, and steepled his fingers before him. "Have you?" he said, his voice a dry, flat monotone. "And what, pray, do you believe you have discovered?" The calm, dismissive tone unleashed a torrent within Elias. The words spilled out of him in a frantic, horrified rush. He spoke of the church records, the pattern of feast and famine and fever. He described the midnight exhumation, the sight of the old man dragging the shrouded forms from the pauper's field. And finally, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper, he described the interior of the smokehouse, the human limbs, the torso, the smaller, heartbreaking forms, the head upon the hook. "I saw it all." Elias finished, his chest heaving. "It is an abomination, a sin that cries out to heaven. We must put a stop to it. We must expose this monster." Parson Goodright listened in silence, his expression unchanging. When Elias was done, the only sound was the relentless ticking of the clock. The parson sighed, a long, weary exhalation that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "You are a young man, Mr. Thorne," he said at last. "You see the world in absolutes. Good and evil. Sanctity and sin. It is a luxury of the inexperienced." He rose slowly from his chair and walked to the window, looking out upon the same misty vista that had filled Elias with such pity. "When I first came to this vale nigh on 30 years ago, I was much like you, full of fire and conviction. And then came the great frost of 18. The snows lay upon the ground from November to April. The livestock died. The stores ran out. Children were starving in their cots, their cries a constant torment. I prayed, Mr. Thorne. I prayed until my knees were raw. And God sent no manna, no quail. He sent only Alaric Grimes." He turned, and his eyes were not those of a monster, but of a man who had long ago damned himself for a cause he believed was greater. "Grimes came to me," Goodright continued, his voice low and relentless. "He laid it out with a butcher's practicality. The old, the sick, the ones who would not survive the winter, they were a drain on resources the living did not have. And in the pauper's field, there was a reservoir, a means to sustain those who still had a chance. He asked me not for permission but for my silence. He argued that the body is but clay, Mr. Thorne, a vessel for the soul which had already departed. Would I have the living starve for the sake of empty, decaying clay? Would I let every soul in this village perish for a point of theological principle?" Elias stared, speechless with horror. The parson was not a captive, he was a willing accomplice. "I looked into the eyes of those starving children," Goodright whispered, his gaze distant, "and I gave him my silence. That winter, we lost 12 to the cold and the hunger. Without Grimes, we would have lost 50, perhaps the entire village. Since that day, I have presided over this arrangement. I have blessed the feasts. I have buried the victims of the subsequent sicknesses. I have shepherded this flock through the valley of the shadow of death, and I have done it by allowing them to walk a path paved with bones. It is the oldest law of this weald, as Grimes told your predecessor, the living must eat and the dead must serve." He stepped closer to Elias, his presence suddenly immense and threatening. "You speak of exposure, of putting a stop to it. Tell me, curate, what would that achieve? Would it bring back the dead? Would it cleanse the palates of those who have partaken for decades? Or would it simply tear the scales from their eyes and show them the hell they have been living in, driving them to madness and self-destruction?" The truth would not save them, Mr. Thorne. It would annihilate them. This knowledge you now possess, it is not a tool for justice. It is a cross. And you must choose whether to bear it in silence, for the good of the flock, or to nail them all to it with your righteous revelation. The parson's words were not a plea, they were a verdict. He had presented Elias with the same hellish choice he himself had faced 30 years prior, and in doing so, had made it terrifyingly clear that there was no authority to appeal to, no higher power within the veil to whom Elias could turn. The unholy knowledge was now theirs to share, a secret pact between a damned shepherd and his horrified under-shepherd, and the price of breaking it was the utter destruction of every soul in their care. The parson's words did not simply hang in the air, they seeped into the very stones of the vicarage, into the worn floorboards, into the marrow of Elias's bones. He retreated from the study as a man retreats from a battlefield, shell-shocked and spiritually dismembered. The confrontation had yielded no righteous path, no clear directive. Instead, it had presented him with two forms of damnation, the active sin of complicity or the passive sin of cataclysmic revelation. Goodright had not defended Grimes's actions as moral, but had framed them as a monstrous necessity, a pragmatic evil chosen over a holier extinction. It was a theology of the abyss, and Elias felt himself teetering on its edge. He sought refuge in the one place that had always offered him solace, the church. But St. Bartholomew the Less was no longer a sanctuary. The cold, damp air felt like a physical manifestation of the village's secret. The cross above the altar seemed a mockery, a symbol of a sacrifice that was pure and singular, not this ongoing, cyclical consumption of the damned by the damned. He fell to his knees before the chancel rail, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white, and he prayed. He prayed for guidance, for a sign, for the strength to know what was right. He poured out his horror, his revulsion, his terror, and his overwhelming pity for the people of the Weald. He begged God to show him the way. But the only answer was the hollow echo of his own whispers in the empty nave. The silence of the church was not the peaceful silence of divine presence. It was the heavy, accusing silence of absence. It was the same silence the previous curate must have heard before his disappearance. Had he, too, knelt here and begged for a sign, only to be met with this same void? The thought was a splinter of ice in Elias's heart. Was God not listening? Or was this veil so utterly given over to its own darkness that even his grace could not penetrate it? His mind became a battleground for warring scriptures. The truth shall set you free clashed violently with, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Was he, in his pristine, uneaten state, without sin? Could he, who had done nothing to stop this horror, claim the moral high ground from which to unleash a truth that would shatter every soul in the village? Parson Goodright's argument was diabolical, yet it held a terrible, pragmatic weight. To reveal the truth was to become the agent of the village's destruction. Was that his duty? To be the angel of revelation, even if that revelation was a sword that would slay them all? He thought of the faces in the tithe barn, eagerly spooning the dark stew into their mouths. He thought of Eleanor Harlow, her grief so raw and new. He thought of the children, their faces smeared with gravy. If he told them, what would become of them? The knowledge would be a poison more potent than any in Grimes's sausages. It would not merely kill the body, it would annihilate the soul, leaving behind a hollowed-out husk haunted by an unthinkable memory. Was it more merciful to let them live in ignorance, to let their physical bodies eventually succumb to the sickness, their souls perhaps finding peace in the afterlife, unaware of the desecration their mortal forms had suffered? Or was the lie itself the greater evil, a corruption that damned them all in the eyes of God? He rose from his knees, his body aching, his spirit more lost than ever. The simple binaries of his faith, heaven and hell, sin and virtue, truth and falsehood, had collapsed into a gray, chaotic morass where every path led to perdition. To be a good shepherd, it seemed, one had to be willing to feed the wolves, or even become one. Parson Goodright had made his choice decades ago, and in doing so, had sold his soul to keep his flock's bodies alive. Elias now faced the same transaction. Could he make it? Could he stand in that pulpit, Sunday after Sunday, and preach of the resurrection of the body, knowing what was happening to those very bodies in the smokehouse on the hill? Could he look Martha Clay in the eye and offer hollow comfort, knowing the full extent of the horror she suspected? He left the church and walked out into the churchyard, his steps carrying him unconsciously towards the northern corner, the pauper's field. The earth where Grimes had dug was already settling, the rough turf doing a poor job of hiding the disturbance. He stood over it, a solitary figure in the gathering twilight, and felt the full weight of his powerlessness. He was the keeper of a secret that could destroy everything, and that very power rendered him utterly impotent. To act was to destroy. Not to act was to condone. His crisis of faith was complete. It was no longer a question of what God wanted him to do. It was a question of what manner of damnation he, Elias Thorne, could live with. The silence of the church had given him no answer, and the silent, violated earth at his feet offered none either. He was alone, adrift on a sea of horror, and the shore was nowhere in sight. Martha Clay's grim prophecy, uttered in the shadowed aftermath of the harvest supper, began to fulfill itself with the grim inevitability of a tolling bell. The first new case was Samuel Rigby, the village blacksmith, a man whose strength was the stuff of local legend, his arms corded with muscle from a lifetime of wielding a hammer. He had been a jovial giant at the feast, laughing loudest, consuming 2 full bowls of the rich stew. A week after John Harlow was laid to rest, Samuel did not rise from his bed. His wife, a stout, pragmatic woman, initially cursed his laziness, but by that evening, her scolding had turned to frantic worry. Dr. Trefoil was summoned, and he emerged from the smithy with the same baffled, defeated expression he had worn at the Harlow cottage. Elias visited, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. The scene was a dreadful echo. The powerful smith was reduced to a shivering skeleton, his skin slick with the same clammy sweat, his eyes wide with the same internal, febrile terror. His ravings were different, yet hauntingly familiar. He did not speak of tasting the dead, but of being among them. "They are so cold in the smoke," he muttered, his voice a thin rasp. "The others, they swing, but I am fixed to the wall. I can feel the salt on my skin. She is looking for me, but she cannot see me through the haze." His wife, Eleanor Rigby, clutched Elias's arm as he left, her face a mask of confusion and dread. "What does it mean, Reverend? What is he saying? He speaks of the smokehouse. Why would he dream of that foul place?" Elias could only offer a hollow platitude, a lie that tasted like ash in his mouth. "The fever conjures phantoms, Mrs. Rigby. Pay no mind to his words." But he saw the doubt in her eyes, a seed of fear that had been planted and was now beginning to sprout. Samuel Rigby's decline was terrifyingly swift. Within 3 days he was gone. The bell of St. Bartholomew's tolled for the second time in as many weeks, its mournful clang seeming to drive the mist deeper into the vale, to soak the very souls of the people in a deeper despair. And it did not stop there. The sickness, once a singular tragedy, was now unmasked as a contagion of consumption. 2 days after Rigby's death, Bessie Fowler, a young mother who had gratefully fed the stew to her children, took to her bed. Then old Thomas the Thatcher, who had no family and had relied on the parson's charity, and thus Grimes's meat, for years. The village, which had begun to recover its spirits after the feast, plunged into a panic far deeper than before. This was no longer one man's misfortune. It was a plague, a scythe cutting through the community, and its pattern was becoming horrifically clear to even the most simple-minded among them. Whispers that had been confined to hushed conversations at the well now broke into open, terrified speculation. They gathered in small, anxious clusters, their voices low. "It took John a week after the supper," one woman said, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "And Samuel the same," Another added, "And Bessie, she was there, she ate her fill." "It's the feast," a man muttered, his face pale. "There's a curse on it. A curse on the food." "But we all ate it," a younger woman wailed, clutching her stomach as if she could feel a worm of doom writhing within. "Are we all to die?" The name, Harlow sickness, was abandoned. Now, they called it the feast fever, a name that directly linked their communal meal to their communal dying. Their suspicion was a blind, groping thing, sensing the outline of the horror but not its true, grotesque shape. They blamed a miasma, a curse, a divine punishment for some collective sin. They could not, imagine the literal, physical truth. But their fear was a tangible force, a current running through the village, and it was flowing directly towards the solitary hut on the edge of the moors. Elias moved among them like a ghost, performing his duties, offering what comfort he could with words that felt like betrayals. He saw the terror in their eyes, the accusatory glances they began to shoot towards the western track that led to Alaric Grimes's property. The Butcher of the Weald was no longer just a figure of scary stories. He was becoming the focal point of their real and present danger. The fragile pact of silence that Parson Goodright had enforced for decades was straining, its fabric tearing under the weight of fresh corpses. The village was a pot coming to a boil, and Elias, trapped between his duty to his flock and his terror of the truth, could only watch as the lid began to rattle, knowing that when it blew, it would scald them all. The atmosphere in Blackmoor Weald curdled from panic into a sullen, watchful dread. The feast fever was no longer a specter but a resident predator, picking them off one by one. The third toll of the bell, for Bessie Fowler, had been followed in quick succession by a fourth for Thomas the Thatcher. Each knell was a hammer blow to the community's spirit, shattering the fragile normalcy they clung to. The villagers no longer gathered in the lanes to talk. They peered from behind cracked doors and through grimy windows, their faces pale and pinched with a suspicion that was slowly crystallizing into a terrible, if incomplete, understanding. The focus of their fear, once a formless miasma, had now found a fixed address. It was at the communal well, the heart of the village's daily life, that the storm began to break. Elias had gone there, hoping to offer some semblance of pastoral care, but found a scene of tense confrontation. A group of men, led by Joseph Miller, the brother of the late John Harlow, had cornered Parson Goodright. Miller's face was a thundercloud of grief and rage. "It's the meat, Parson," Miller stated, his voice low and shaking with the effort to control it. "We all know it now. It's the meat from Grimes. John fell sick after the last lot he bought. Samuel ate his weight in it at the supper. Bessie too. It's poisoned, I tell you. The man is a poisoner." Parson Goodright stood his ground, his own face a rigid mask of authority, but Elias could see a faint sheen of sweat on his brow. "This is reckless talk, Joseph," the parson boomed, though the resonance lacked its usual force. "You speak of a man who has provided for this village in its leanest times. You would cast aspersions without a shred of proof? It is a fever, a contagion, as Dr. Trefoil has said." "Dr. Trefoil doesn't know his arse from his elbow," a voice shouted from the back of the crowd, a breach of decorum that would have been unthinkable a month prior. "He can't stop it, can he? My boy is abed with it now, and he ate that damned sausage just yesterday." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. The fear was turning, as it always does, towards a need for a culprit, for a tangible enemy to fight. "What does he put in them, eh?" Miller pressed, stepping closer to the parson. "His secret blend? What herbs from the moor make a man waste away and babble of smoke and the dead? I've heard them, parson. I've heard the things they say. My brother John, he said he tasted our old granda. He said it." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The specific, grotesque detail, spoken aloud in the light of day, landed with the force of a physical blow. The superstition of the Weald, the old fears of the dead not resting, began to intertwine with this new, tangible suspicion. Their gazes, as one, turned westward, towards the rising ground where the plume of smoke from Grimes's chimney was just visible against the grey sky. It was then that Elias saw Alaric Grimes himself. The old butcher was standing at the edge of the small crowd, having approached as silently as a shadow. He held a string of his dark sausages in one hand, and his pale, milky eyes swept over the assembled villagers with an expression not of fear, but of cold contempt. The conversation died instantly. The crowd seemed to shrink back from him, as if his very presence was a blight. "You speak of poison, Joseph Miller," Grimes said, his voice like the grating of stones. "Yet your family has eaten my meat for 20 years. It put strength in your father's arm and flesh on your mother's bones. Has it poisoned you until now?" He held up the sausages. "This is strength. This is life, drawn from the weald itself. You fear it because you are weak. You fear the price." "What price?" Miller shot back, though his voice had lost some of its bluster. "What is your price, you old devil?" Grimes's thin lips curled into that terrible, knowing smile. "The weald provides," he said, his gaze sweeping over them all, lingering for a chilling moment on Elias. "But the weald must also be fed. It is the oldest law." He turned and walked away, back towards his hut, leaving a silence behind him that was more terrifying than any outburst. His words were a riddle, but to Elias, they were a confession as stark as the ledger in the vestry. The weald must also be fed. The meaning was clear. The land demanded a sacrifice, and Grimes was its priest, ensuring the offering was made and then recycled in a monstrous communion. The crowd dispersed, but the mood was irrevocably changed. The vague suspicion had been given a voice, a target, and a cryptic, terrifying justification. They were no longer just afraid of a sickness. They were afraid of the butcher and of the ancient, hungry law he served. Parson Goodright shot Elias a look, a complex mixture of warning, exhaustion, and a plea for continued silence, before stalking back towards the vicarage. Elias stood alone by the well, the taste of copper and dread in his mouth. The gathering storm was no longer on the horizon. It was here, and the first cold drops of its fury were beginning to fall. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his soul, that the next death would not be met with whispers and fear, but with fire and iron. The confrontation at the well marked a schism in the soul of Blackmoor Weald, a fissure that ran deeper than the peat in the fens. Elias Thorne returned to the vicarage, but he carried the charged silence of the villagers with him. It was a physical pressure, a storm light waiting to earth itself. Parson Goodright had retreated into his study, the door firmly closed, a tacit admission that his authority, built on a foundation of terrible secrets, was now crumbling. Elias could no longer seek guidance there. The well of corrupted wisdom had run dry. He was adrift, the white collar around his neck feeling less like a symbol of office and more like a noose slowly tightening. His duties became a grotesque pantomime. Visiting the sick, now numbering 4 new souls since the blacksmith's passing, was a fresh descent into hell each time. He would sit by their bedsides, holding a hand that was rapidly becoming skeletal, listening to ravings that were variations on a single horrific theme. A young woman, barely out of her girlhood, muttered about the salt in the smoke crusting her lips. An old man, his mind gone, cried out that he was hanging with the others, waiting his turn. They were not speaking in metaphor. They were describing, in the fractured poetry of delirium, the very processes of Alaric Grimes's smokehouse. They were tasting their own curing, feeling their own desecration in their fever dreams. Elias would recite the Lord's Prayer, the words, "Give us this day our daily bread," sticking in his throat like a shard of bone. He was administering last rites to souls who were, in a literal sense, being consumed by the community he was supposed to shepherd into the afterlife. The blasphemy of it was enough to make him dizzy. The funerals were worse. He now stood beside Parson Goodright at the graveside, the two of them a united front of holy hypocrisy. As the parson's voice droned on about ashes to ashes and dust to dust, Elias's eyes would be fixed on the freshly turned earth, knowing with a sick certainty that this was not an end, but merely a temporary interment. This body, currently being committed to the ground with solemnity, was destined for the butcher's block and the smokehouse, to be transformed into the very sustenance that would send more of the mourners to this same spot. He watched the grieving faces, Joseph Miller's hardened mask of loss, Eleanor Rigby's vacant stare, and felt the weight of his silence as a physical agony. He was an accomplice to this cycle of damnation, his black coat the same color as the sin he was helping to conceal. The village itself was turning inwards, its social fabric rotting from the inside out. The trust that had once bound neighbors together was gone, replaced by a festering paranoia. People locked their doors at night, not against some spectral gray lady, but against each other. The cheerful exchange of goods and favors ceased. A gift of food was now viewed with deep suspicion. Was it clean? Was it from a safe source? Or did it contain the hidden contagion? The communal pot was abandoned, every family cooked for itself, behind closed doors, their meals now a source of anxiety rather than comfort. The children, sensing the fear of their elders, became quiet and withdrawn, their games ceasing. The very sound of life was being leached from the Weald, replaced by a watchful, fearful hush. Elias found himself walking more, striding out across the moors in a futile attempt to outpace the horror that dogged his steps. But the wilderness offered no solace. The gorse and heather seemed to clutch at his legs, the crying of the birds sounded like the wails of the damned. The landscape itself felt complicit, a vast, brooding entity that had spawned Alaric Grimes and his unholy craft. He would look back at the village nestled in its bowl, the thin, constant plume of smoke from Grimes's chimney a dark scar on the sky, and feel a despair so complete it threatened to unmoor his mind. He was trapped in an ethical prison of his own making. To speak was to unleash a madness that would make the current sufferings seem like a blessing. To remain silent was to be a party to an ongoing atrocity. His faith provided no key. He had prayed for a sign, for a clear path, and had been met only with the echoing screams of the dying and the accusatory silence of God. The weight of the collar was the weight of the entire vale, its secrets, its sins, and its doomed inhabitants. It was a burden he felt increasingly unable to bear, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the fragile dam of silence was going to break. The only question was whether it would break by his hand, or by the furious, desperate hands of the villagers, and what bloody torrent would follow when it did. The pressure was building, and the black wool of his cassock felt like a shroud. The fifth death broke something fundamental within the community. It was not a robust farmer or a hardy laborer, but the miller's youngest child, a girl of no more than 6 summers named Lily. She had been a favorite in the village, a bright, chattering thing with hair the color of straw, forever chasing chickens or weaving clumsy daisy chains. She had not eaten much of the stew at the harvest supper, but she had devoured the slices of dark sausage her father had given her, pronouncing them the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. Her decline was a swift, brutal tragedy that extinguished one of the last flickers of light in Blackmoor Weald. She did not rave of smoke or the dead. She simply faded, her vivacity leaching away into a profound lethargy, until one morning she did not wake up. The bell tolled for her, a sound so high and pitiful it seemed to crack the very sky. The grief that followed was not the sullen, fearful thing that had accompanied the previous deaths. It was a raw, screaming, primal agony. Joseph Miller, already hollowed by his brother's death, was utterly destroyed. His wife, Sarah, fell into a catatonic state from which she did not emerge. The village looked upon this fresh horror, this murder of innocence, and its collective sorrow began to curdle into a cold, focused rage. The abstract fear of the feast fever had now been given a face, a small, pale, lifeless face, and a target. The funeral was a tense, ugly affair. The entire village stood gathered around the tiny grave dug in the consecrated ground, but the sanctity of the moment was poisoned. Eyes, red-rimmed and hard, were not fixed on the small coffin, but flicked constantly towards Parson Goodright and Elias as they conducted the service, and then, with a burning intensity, towards the back of the crowd where Alaric Grimes stood, apart from them all as always. He had come, an act of monstrous audacity, his presence a silent challenge. He did not look at the grieving parents. His pale, milky eyes were fixed on the small hole in the earth, and on his face was not grief, but a kind of grim assessment, the look of a farmer calculating a future yield. As the final prayer was uttered and the first clods of earth were thrown onto the little coffin, Joseph Miller could contain himself no longer. He let out a strangled cry, part sob, part roar of fury, and broke from the crowd. He did not go to his wife. He strode towards Alaric Grimes, his big, work-roughened hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. "You!" he screamed, his voice tearing through the solemn quiet. "You did this. You and your cursed meat. You poisoned my brother. You poisoned my child." The crowd stirred, a low, dangerous murmur rising from them. They were a single spark away from becoming a mob. Grimes did not flinch. He stood his ground, his expression one of cold contempt. "I provide sustenance, Miller. Nothing more. The Weald gives and the Weald takes. Your girl was weak. The strong survive." The statement, so callous, so utterly devoid of humanity, was the spark. A wave of angry shouts erupted. Men stepped forward, their own grief and fear finding a voice in Miller's rage. They saw not an old man, but the personification of the plague that was devouring them. It was then that Martha Clay, who had been standing as still as a statue throughout the service, pointed a trembling, bony finger at Grimes. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, rasping thing, but it cut through the din with the force of a prophecy. "Look at his hands," she shrieked. "Look at the mark of the beast, the rust that will not wash away. It is the blood of our kin. It is the stain of the grave." Every eye turned to Grimes's hands. The old butcher, for the first time, seemed to react. He instinctively curled his fingers, but it was too late. The villagers saw what they had always seen but never truly registered, the deep, rusty, reddish-brown stain that was ground into the skin of his hands and under his thick, blackened nails. It was not the transient stain of pig's blood, which washes away. This was a permanent tattoo of his trade, a perpetual reminder of the raw material with which he worked. In the heightened, superstitious terror of the moment, Martha's words transformed it from a butcher's occupational hazard into a diabolical sigil. "The mark," someone else yelled. "He bears the mark of the devil's work." "It's true. It's all true." The mob mentality, that fearsome alchemy of grief, fear, and superstition, took hold. The abstract concept of the curse now had a physical manifestation. The enemy was no longer a miasma or a fever. He was a man with the blood of their children on his hands, a man marked by Cain. The dam of fear and deference finally broke. With a collective roar, the men of the village surged forward. Grimes, his eyes widening with something that might have been surprise, or perhaps just a flicker of long-dormant animal instinct, turned and fled, not towards his hut, but into the open moors. The mob, led by the grief-maddened Joseph Miller, poured after him, a torrent of righteous fury giving chase to the source of their damnation. The churchyard was left empty save for the weeping women, the tiny, uncovered grave, and Elias Thorne, who stood frozen, watching the hunt begin, knowing that whatever its outcome, Blackmoor Weald had passed a point of no return from which there could be no coming back. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The somber, grief-stricken congregation became a pack, their individual identities subsumed into a single, roaring entity of vengeance. The sight of Alaric Grimes fleeing, the hunched, predatory figure who had haunted the edges of their lives for decades now running like a startled animal, unleashed a primal bloodlust. They streamed out of the churchyard, a tide of humanity armed not with guns or scythes, but with the tools of their daily labor that had now become instruments of retribution: hay forks, wood axes, and the heavy hammers of the blacksmith's apprentices. Their shouts were no longer words, but a unified, guttural cry that echoed across the vale: a sound that had not been heard since forgotten ages of tribal war. Elias, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, stood for a moment paralyzed at the graveside. The rational part of his mind, the part forged at Cambridge, screamed that this was madness, a descent into the very savagery he had been sent to combat. But another, darker part, the part that had seen the smokehouse and carried the weight of the terrible secret, felt a grim, horrific satisfaction. The truth was out. Not the whole, complex, damning truth, but a version of it, weaponized by superstition and grief. The beast was being brought to bay. He found his legs moving without conscious command, following the mob at a distance. He was not a participant. He was a witness, a chronicler of the damnation he had been powerless to prevent. The chase led away from the village, up onto the wild, trackless moors. The mist, which had seemed a passive nuisance before, now became an active participant, swirling and thickening, sometimes obscuring the hunters and the hunted, sometimes revealing them in brief, tableau-like glimpses. The villagers, fueled by rage, moved with a brutal speed, their knowledge of the local terrain giving them an advantage over the old man. But Grimes, too, knew these moors intimately. He moved not with the panicked flight of a rabbit, but with the cunning of a fox, ducking behind tors of granite, disappearing into patches of dense gorse, his dark clothing making him a phantom in the gloom. Elias followed the sound, the crashing of bodies through bracken, the shouted curses, the occasional triumphant yell when they caught a glimpse of their quarry. He saw Joseph Miller, his face a grotesque mask of tears and rage, leading the charge, his axe held high. He saw the mob flow around the landscape like a single, multi-limbed creature, its purpose absolute. They were no longer farmers and shepherds. They were the furies of Greek tragedy, unleashed upon the blight that had poisoned their world. The chase wore on, the initial burst of energy giving way to a dogged, relentless pursuit. The moor began to fight back. A man cried out as his ankle turned in a rabbit hole. Another sank to his knee in a patch of hidden bog, requiring two others to haul him free, sucking and cursing. The mist dampened their clothes and their enthusiasm, the cold seeping into their bones. But the image of little Lily Miller's coffin and the sight of the mark on Grimes's hands drove them onward. Elias, keeping his distance, felt the landscape's malevolence. The wind whipped through the heather with a sound like mocking laughter. The gnarled, stunted trees seemed to reach for him with claw-like branches. He understood, with a chilling clarity, why this place bred such horrors. It was a land that demanded sacrifice, that fed on despair. Alaric Grimes was not an anomaly. He was the Weald's most perfect and terrible creation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the shouts of the mob changed in timbre. The frustrated cries of pursuit coalesced into a unified, roaring crescendo. They had cornered him. Elias hurried forward, scrambling up a steep, rocky incline, his breath catching in his chest. He reached the top and looked down into a small, natural amphitheater, a bowl of land surrounded by low cliffs. There, with his back against a wall of wet stone, stood Alaric Grimes. He was panting, his shoulders heaving, but he had not dropped his defiant posture. The mob formed a semicircle before him, their weapons pointed, their faces savage in the misty half-light. For a long moment, there was silence, broken only by the wind and the ragged breaths of the hunters and the hunted. Joseph Miller stepped forward, his axe held ready. "No more running, butcher," Miller snarled, his voice trembling with exhaustion and hate. "You fed on us for the last time." Grimes looked at the ring of hardened faces, at the glinting metal of the tools meant for his dismemberment. And then he did something utterly unexpected. He smiled. It was not a smile of defiance nor of madness. It was a smile of cold, terrifying triumph. His pale eyes swept over them, and he spoke, his voice cutting through the wind with unnatural clarity. "You think this is an end?" he rasped. "You are fools. You have eaten of the Weald. You have taken its strength into your bellies and into your bones. It is in you now. All of you. You can kill me, but the hunger remains. The Weald is hungry, and it will always be fed. His words landed not as a plea, but as a curse. He was telling them that his death would not break the cycle, it would only make them the new inheritors of the ghastly tradition. The mark was not just on his hands, it was on their souls. The mob hesitated, the certainty of their rage momentarily shaken by this chilling prophecy. They stood on the brink of violence, the old butcher before them and the terrible truth of his words hanging in the cold, damp air. The hunt was over, but the true horror was only just beginning. The momentary hesitation born of Grimes's cryptic curse lasted only a heartbeat. It was a fragile thing, shattered by the raw, uncomplicated grief of Joseph Miller. The butcher's words, meant to paralyze, instead acted as a final, unforgivable provocation. To suggest that the defilement of his child was an unbreakable, natural law was to pour oil onto the fire of Miller's rage. With a wordless roar that was torn from the very depths of his being, Miller lunged. The axe, a tool meant for splitting logs, described a short, brutal arc. There was no ceremony, no trial, no last rite. The steel bit deep into the junction of Alaric Grimes' neck and shoulder with a wet, crunching thud. The sound was not loud, but it was horribly final, a punctuation mark to decades of silent complicity. A collective gasp, sharp and involuntary, escaped the mob. They watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the old man did not cry out. He staggered back against the rock, his milky eyes wide with what might have been surprise, or perhaps merely the physical shock of the blow. His mouth worked, but no sound emerged save for a wet, gurgling exhalation. He slid down the wet stone, leaving a dark, slick trail behind him, and collapsed into a heap at its base, the axe still buried in his flesh. The strength, the cunning, the terrifying presence that had dominated the Weald for generations was extinguished in an instant. A profound silence fell, broken only by the relentless wind and Joseph Miller's ragged panting. He stood over the body, his chest heaving, his hands dangling at his sides, now empty. The red mist of his fury cleared, and what was left in its place was a vast, hollow emptiness. He had achieved his vengeance, but the sight of the crumpled form, so small and pathetic in death, offered no solace. The void left by his daughter remained, now joined by the grim reality of murder. The other men slowly lowered their weapons. The communal rage that had bound them together dissipated, leaving behind a collection of individuals suddenly confronted with the brutal, physical fact of what they had done. They were not soldiers, they were farmers and craftsmen. The sight of the blood, so dark it was almost black against the gray rock and green moss, was a sobering shock. They had crossed a line from which there was no return, not in the eyes of the law, and not in their own souls. No one moved to retrieve the axe. It stood from Grimes's body like a grim standard, a declaration of their new, bloody sovereignty. The mark on his hands was now just another stain, soon to be subsumed by the greater stains spreading from the mortal wound. Elias, watching from the ridge, felt his stomach clench. He had wanted justice, perhaps, or an end to the horror, but this was a raw, pagan slaughter. It felt less like a triumph over evil and more like a sacrifice to the very same dark forces Grimes had served. After a long minute, one of the older men, a shepherd named Evans, finally spoke, his voice hushed. "What do we do with it?" The question hung in the air. They could not leave him here for the crows and foxes. That felt like an invitation for his spirit to haunt the moors. They could not bring him back to the village for a Christian burial. The very idea was a blasphemy that sickened them all. He was untouchable in life, and now he was untouchable in death. Joseph Miller finally stirred. "The bog," he said, his voice flat and dead. "The deep bog by the standing stone. Let the Weald have him back. Let it swallow him whole." A grim murmur of agreement passed through the men. It was a fitting end, a poetic justice of sorts. The entity he claimed to serve would become his tomb. They moved forward, their movements stiff and reluctant. Using a length of rope someone had thought to bring, they tied the old man's ankles together. Then, avoiding the handle of the axe as if it were red-hot, they began to drag the body out of the stone bowl and across the springy turf of the moor towards the vast, treacherous peat bog that lay to the north. Elias did not follow. He remained on the ridge, watching the macabre procession until the mist and the rolling land swallowed them from view. The hunt was over. The butcher of Blackmoor Weald was dead. But as he turned his gaze back towards the village, nestled in its veil beneath the ever-present pall of smoke, he felt no sense of peace. Grimes's final words echoed in his mind, more potent and terrifying in death than they had been in life. The hunger remains. The Weald is hungry, and it will always be fed. They had killed the priest, but the altar, the smokehouse, the pauper's field, the terrible knowledge and the primal need to survive remained. They had slain the monster, but they had not broken the curse. If anything, they had just taken the first, bloody step towards inheriting it. The return of the hunters was a somber, silent affair. They did not come back as triumphant victors, but as weary, blood-stained men, their shoulders slumped under a weight far heavier than any corpse. They brought no trophy, no proof of their deed. The only evidence was the grim set of their jaws, the hollow look in their eyes, and the dark, damp stains on their trousers from dragging their burden through the bog. They dispersed to their cottages without a word, each man locking his door against the coming night and the ghosts that now surely walked the Weald. The village, which had hummed with furious energy hours before, was now preternaturally still, as if holding its breath. In the days that followed, a strange and unsettling quiet descended upon Blackmoor Weald. The immediate, feverish panic had been cauterized by the violence on the moors, but it was replaced by a pervasive, low-grade dread. The feast fever, as if sensing the demise of its architect, seemed to pause its grim work. No new cases were reported. The few who were still ill lingered in their wasted states, but did not immediately worsen. A fragile, desperate hope began to kindle. Perhaps the curse was broken. Perhaps the poison had been purged from their world with the butcher's life. This hope, however, soon collided with a more immediate and mundane reality, hunger. With Alaric Grimes gone, the primary source of cheap, readily available meat vanished. The villagers, particularly the poorest among them, had structured their meager diets around his provisions for generations. His sausages and cured meats had been the bulwark against starvation during the lean months. Now that bulwark was gone. The full impact of this loss became apparent within a week. The village had no other butcher. The few pigs and scrawny sheep kept by families were for milk, wool, and breeding, not for regular slaughter. The game on the moors was scarce and wily. The autumn harvest had been poor. For the first time in living memory, the people of Blackmoor Weald faced the prospect of a winter with an empty larder and the specter of outright starvation. A terror they thought Grimes had banished forever, now returned with a vengeance. Elias witnessed this new anxiety take root. He saw it in the faces of mothers counting their dwindling stores of grain, in the way men looked at their few livestock with a new, calculating expression. The conversations at the well, when they happened at all, were no longer about fever and curses, but about sacks of barley and root cellars. The collective trauma of the feast fever began to be overshadowed by the primal fear of an empty belly. The moral horror of what they might have eaten was slowly being supplanted by the physical horror of having nothing to eat at all. It was Joseph Miller who gave voice to the unthinkable. Elias encountered him standing outside the Grimes property, staring at the silent, dark hut and the locked smokehouse with a complex expression of hatred, fear, and a desperate, nascent curiosity. The rest of the village gave the place a wide berth, as if it were plagued, but Miller stood his ground. "He's gone," Miller said, not turning as Elias approached. His voice was flat, the fire of his vengeance utterly spent. "The devil is in the bog. But his larder, it ain't empty, is it?" Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "Joseph, you cannot be thinking." "What am I to think, Reverend?" Miller turned, his eyes blazing with a fresh, more hopeless kind of agony. My child is dead. My brother is dead. My wife, she is a ghost. And now the winter comes, and I have nothing. Nothing. He gestured violently towards the smokehouse. There is food in there. Food that he meant to sell us. Food that might have saved my Lily had it been clean. He spat on the ground. It's just meat, isn't it? Just feed. If we burn the rest, if we cleanse it with fire, could we not use what is there? To survive? What is the sin in using what is left, if it keeps our children from starving? Elias was struck dumb. The monstrous logic was a perversion of the very pragmatism Parson Goodright had espoused. It was the cycle trying to reassert itself, even with its high priest dead. The hunger was indeed still there, just as Grimes had promised. Not just a physical hunger, but the hunger for a solution, for a way to survive in a world that offered none. Miller was not advocating for a return to the old ways. He was groping for a way to salvage a terrible resource from the wreckage, to desecrate the desecration for a noble cause. It was a testament to how thoroughly Grimes had warped their world, that even in death, his legacy of impossible, damning choices continued to haunt them. The empty larder was not just a physical space. It was a void, and Elias watched in horror as the village began to peer into it, wondering what monstrous things they might find to fill it. The silence in the vicarage had become a physical entity, a third occupant that sat with Elias and Parson Goodright at their meager meals and listened to the ticking of the clock in the hall. Since the death of Alaric Grimes, the parson had retreated into a profound and unsettling stillness. He performed his Sunday duties by rote, his sermons stripped of their former fire, delivered in a monotone that echoed the hopelessness settling over the vale. The authority that had once radiated from him was gone, leaving behind a husk of a man, bowed by a burden he could no longer share. One evening, as a hard, cold rain lashed against the windows, Elias found the parson not in his study, but in the small, fireless parlor, sitting in a high-backed chair and staring into the empty grate. A single candle guttered on the table beside him, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to pluck at the edges of his gaunt frame. He held a small, leather-bound book in his hands, his thumbs stroking its cover with a strange, weary tenderness. "Mr. Thorne," he said without turning. His voice was a dry rustle, barely audible above the storm. "Sit. There's a matter of which I must unburden myself." Elias sat in the chair opposite, the cold leather seeping through his trousers. He said nothing, sensing that the dam, so long and so carefully maintained, was finally about to break. The parson did not look at him. His eyes remained fixed on the dead hearth, as if he could see visions in the soot-stained brick. "The book you found in the vestry," Goodright began. "The one with the frantic writing in the margin. The curate who wrote those words, his name was Albright. William Albright. He was a good man. Better than I. He came here like you, full of light, and he discovered the truth as you did." He paused, the memory a palpable pain in the room. "He confronted me. He was going to ride to Penrith, to the magistrate. He believed the law and the light of God could cleanse this place." A long, shuddering sigh escaped him. "I could not let him. I knew what the revelation would do. It would not have been a cleansing. It would have been a conflagration. The village would have been quarantined, shunned, perhaps even burned. The people would have been torn apart by the knowledge. So, I went to Grimes." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. He leaned forward, his heart pounding. "I did not ask him to do it," Goodright whispered, the words torn from him. "I only told him that Albright was a threat to the arrangement, to the survival of the Weald. I told him the curate was leaving for Penrith at first light." He finally turned his head, and his eyes in the candlelight were pools of bottomless guilt and torment. "I knew what he was. I knew what he would do. I gave him the information, and I went to my bed, and I listened to the storm, and I prayed I was wrong." He looked down at the book in his hands. This was his. Albright's. Grimes brought it to me the next morning, along with the man's traveling cloak, sodden and torn. He said he had found it by the bog, that the curate must have lost his way in the storm. There was no body to recover. We held a service for an empty coffin. He held the journal out to Elias. Its leather was stained and warped, as if by water and something darker. I have kept it these 30 years. My personal hell. The weight of a man's soul. Elias took the book. It felt impossibly heavy. The final piece of the horror slid into place. Parson Goodright was not merely a passive accomplice who had accepted a grim reality. He was an active participant. He had used the monster as his instrument, sacrificing a good man to preserve his damned and damning peace. He had not just condoned the abomination, he had fed it. The cycle is not just Grimes's, the parson said, his voice breaking. It is mine. It is ours. We are all a part of it. I thought I was saving the village, but I was only damning it more completely, and myself along with it. I have shepherded my flock straight into the belly of the beast, and I have convinced them it was salvation. He looked at Elias, his face a tragic mask of ruin. You asked me what to do. I have no answer. I only have a warning. The hunger that Grimes spoke of, it does not reside only in the belly. It resides in the soul. It is the hunger to survive at any cost, to make the terrible choice, to sacrifice others to preserve the whole. I have fed that hunger for 30 years. And now I fear it has grown so strong it can feed itself. He turned back to the empty fireplace, his confession complete, his spirit seemingly extinguished. Elias sat holding the dead curate's journal, the cold, damp weight of it a tangible link in a chain of complicity that stretched back decades. The horror was not just in the smokehouse or the graveyard. It was here, in this very room, in the heart of God's appointed shepherd. The butcher of the Weald was dead, but his true successor, Elias realized with a sickening jolt, had been sitting in the vicarage all along. The contents of William Albright's journal completed Elias's descent into the full, panoramic nightmare of Blackmoor Weald. The script, initially neat and confident, deteriorated into the same frantic, slanting hand he had seen in the parish ledger. It spoke of a young man's earnest attempts to understand his new parish, his growing unease, his discovery of the pattern, and finally, his own midnight vigil and the horrific confirmation in the smokehouse. The final, unfinished entry was a heart-wrenching plea for guidance, a desperate prayer for strength to do what was right. It ended with the words, "I have confronted Goodright. He is not what he seems. There is a complicity in his eyes that chills me to the bone. I fear I have made a terrible error in trusting him. I must ride for Penrith at first light. I pray God grants me." The journal fell from Elias's numb fingers. Albright had not been lost to the bog. He had been delivered to it, on the orders of the man who had sworn to guide his soul. The knowledge was a poison more potent than any in Grimes's larder. It meant that the institution meant to be their moral compass was itself the engine of the corruption. There was no appeal to a higher authority within the village, for the highest authority was the architect of the silence. This revelation festered within Elias as a new and different kind of dread began to stalk the village. With Grimes gone and his smokehouse locked and shunned, a strange occurrence began to be reported. It started with a child's tale, dismissed as a nightmare. Then a shepherd, returning late from the high pastures, swore he saw a flickering, lambent light within the sealed smokehouse, a glow that was not the steady red of embers, but a pale, shifting phosphorescence. The story spread and others came forward. They spoke of hearing sounds from within the stone building, not the sounds of industry, but a low, wet, slithering noise, like something heavy being dragged across the earthen floor. The most chilling account came from Martha Clay. She claimed that upon walking past the property at twilight, she had seen a figure, tall, gaunt, and shimmering with a faint, smoky luminescence, standing beside the smokehouse door. It was not Alaric Grimes, she insisted. The shape was wrong, the presence different. This was not the solid, bloody reality of the butcher, but something spectral, a thing of vapor and memory. She called it the ghost in the smoke, and the name stuck. The village, already balanced on a knife edge of fear and hunger, was thrown into a fresh panic. Had their violence on the moor not laid the horror to rest? Had they, instead, unleashed something else? Was it the vengeful spirit of Grimes himself, returned to claim his domain? Or was it, as some of the more superstitious whispered, the collective soul of all the desecrated dead, given a single, ghastly form, a guardian of the cursed larder they had created? The locked smokehouse, once a place of tangible, if horrific, reality, now became a nexus of supernatural terror. No one would go near it. The path to Grimes's hut became overgrown within days, as if nature itself was seeking to reclaim the blighted ground. But the stories of the light and the sounds persisted, growing in the telling. The physical hunger in their bellies was now joined by a metaphysical terror that gnawed at their minds. They had killed the butcher, but they had not silenced the past. The sins of the Weald, it seemed, were not so easily buried. They could still take form, could still walk, could still haunt the periphery of their vision, a pale, shimmering reminder that some hungers are so profound they can outlive the flesh, and some fires, once lit, can never truly be extinguished. The ghost in the smoke became the new face of their curse, a spectral warden ensuring that the terrible secret of Blackmoor Weald, and the dreadful hunger it served, would not be so easily forgotten. The spectral fears, potent as they were, could not compete for long with the brutal, grinding reality of empty stomachs. The ghost in the smoke was a terror for the night, but the gnawing hunger was a constant companion from dawn until dusk. The autumn rains gave way to the first hard frosts of early winter, and the true severity of their situation became inescapable. The meager stores of grain and root vegetables, carefully hoarded, were dwindling at an alarming rate. The game on the moors had grown scarce and wary, and the few rabbits or birds that were snared provided little more than a mouthful for a family. The village of Blackmoor Weald was beginning to starve. It was a slow, insidious process. The adults grew thin, their faces becoming sharp and angular, their eyes taking on a dull, listless sheen. They moved with less purpose, conserving their dwindling energy. The children, who had been quieted by fear, were now silenced by weakness. Their playful shouts were no longer heard in the lanes. Instead, there was only the faint, fretful crying of the hungry, a sound that tore at the heart. The vibrant, if grim, life of the village was leaching away, leaving behind a community of gray, shuffling shades. Elias moved among them, his own rations severely curtailed, feeling a helplessness more profound than any he had felt before. He could offer prayers, but he had no bread. He could speak of God's mercy, but his words rang hollow in the face of a child's sunken eyes and a mother's desperate, empty hands. He saw the social contract of the village fraying and snapping. The trust that had bound them was replaced by a furtive, desperate selfishness. A stolen turnip from a neighbor's patch became a capital crime. Friendships of a lifetime were broken over a handful of barley. The community was atomizing, each family retreating into its own private circle of misery, seeing every other person as a competitor for the dwindling food. It was in this atmosphere of primal need that the whispers began again. They were no longer about ghosts or curses. They were about the smokehouse. Joseph Miller's desperate, blasphemous logic began to find more receptive ears. The argument was simple, brutal, and repeated in hushed tones behind closed doors. "It's just meat now, ain't it?" a man would mutter to his wife. "Grimes is gone. The evil is out of it. It's been smoked and cured. It'll keep through the winter." "But it's them," the wife would whisper back, her face pale. "Them's gone to God," the man would argue, his voice tight with hunger. "Their souls are safe. It's just the clay left, like the parson always said, empty clay. And our children are wasting away for the lack of it." The terrible pragmatism that Parson Goodright and Alaric Grimes had nurtured for decades was now bearing its final, most bitter fruit. The villagers had been conditioned to see the human body as a resource. The moral horror was being slowly eroded by the physiological imperative to survive. The line between the unthinkable and the necessary was blurring, smudged by the relentless pressure of starvation. Elias saw the change in their eyes when he passed them. The hollow look of hunger was now sometimes joined by a flicker of something else, a calculating, shameful glint when they looked towards the western track. They were not considering a return to the old cycle. They were contemplating the consumption of its final, frozen capital. The stockpile in the smokehouse was a perverse inheritance, a last, damned reserve to be used in extremis. The famine's bite was sharpening their minds, whittling away their scruples, and leading them to gaze upon the source of their curse not with revulsion, but with the desperate, avid eyes of survivors. The ghost in the smoke was forgotten. All that remained was the hunger, and the locked stone building that held the only answer to it. The question was no longer if they would break, but when, and who would be the first to lift the latch. The desperate calculus of hunger, once confined to furtive whispers behind bolted doors, could not remain hidden for long. It erupted into open, bitter conflict at a hastily convened meeting in the tithe barn, a gathering that bore none of the forced festivity of the harvest supper but all of its grim portent. The air was frigid, the faces of the assembled villagers were haggard and pinched in the light of a few guttering tallow dips, and the tension was a live thing, coiling in the smoky darkness. Parson Goodright, looking more spectral than ever, presided with a vacant air, his authority having evaporated along with the village's moral certainty. The division was stark and immediate. On one side stood a faction led by Joseph Miller and those who had lost the most to the feast fever. Their grief had hardened into a rigid, absolute position. "We will not touch it." Miller's voice, though weakened by hunger, was sharp with conviction. "We will not become him. My daughter, my brother, their bodies are in that place. To eat from that larder is to consume them a second time. It is to make us no better than the monster we sent to the bog. I would rather my family starve cleanly, our souls intact, than live another day with that filth in our bellies and that sin on our souls." His words were met with fervent, if weary, agreement from a solid portion of the crowd. They saw the smokehouse as the physical heart of the curse, and to partake of its contents, for any reason, was to willingly damn themselves. It was a matter of spiritual purity, a final, desperate stand for their humanity in the face of an inhuman choice. Arrayed against them was a larger and increasingly desperate group. Their leader was a pragmatic, dour farmer named Walter Higgs, a man who had always been more concerned with yields and survival than with theology. "This is pride, Miller. Foolish, starving pride." Higgs argued, his voice rasping. "You speak of souls, but I see bodies wasting away before my eyes. My children cry for food I cannot give them. What use is a clean soul in a dead body? Grimes is gone. The evil intent is gone. What remains is protein and fat, smoked and salted. It is sustenance, nothing more. To let it rot while we perish is the greater sin. It is a waste, a blasphemy against the life we are trying to preserve." His argument, grounded in the brutal reality of their circumstances, resonated deeply with those who could no longer bear the sound of their children's hunger. They saw the smokehouse not as a cursed tomb, but as a storehouse, a grim gift from a devil they had slain. The philosophical horror was being crushed under the weight of biological necessity. Elias watched the debate unfold, his heart sickened. He saw the community he had come to serve tearing itself in two. It was no longer a unified village but two warring tribes, the purists, who chose a holy death, and the pragmatists, who were willing to embrace a damned life. The arguments flew back and forth, becoming more personal, more venomous. "You would have us become ghouls," a purist woman shrieked. "And you would have my babe die for your principles," a pragmatist mother screamed back, clutching a listless infant to her chest. "It is the mark you would take upon yourselves," Martha Clay cried out, her voice cutting through the din, "not on your hands, but on your very souls." The only mark I care about is the one the grave will make on my child's forehead if I do nothing." Higgs retorted fiercely. Parson Goodright offered no guidance. He simply stared into the middle distance, a broken pontiff in a church of the damned. The meeting broke up without resolution, but the lines had been drawn in the frozen earth of the churchyard. The purists, led by Miller, withdrew to their cottages, a solemn, determined band preparing for a martyr's end. The pragmatists, a larger and more volatile group, clustered around Walter Higgs, their faces set in expressions of grim resolve. They had made their decision. The dividing of the village was complete. The fragile bonds of community, strained by horror and fear, had finally snapped under the relentless pressure of famine. Blackmoor Weald was now 2 villages occupying the same cursed ground, and the silence that fell after the shouting was more terrifying than any that had come before, for it was the silence of a schism that could only end in tragedy. The gnawing emptiness in their bellies became a third, uninvited participant in every conversation, a silent arbitrator in every decision. The whispered, shameful logic that had begun in the privacy of desperate homes could no longer be contained. It demanded a public hearing, a collective facing of the abyss. The gathering was not called by the peal of the church bell, which had become an instrument of dread, but by a grim, unspoken consensus. They assembled in the tithe barn as they had for the feast, but the atmosphere was now its funereal opposite. The great space was cavernous and freezing, the breath of the huddled villagers pluming in the dim light of a few meager tallow candles that fought a losing battle against the encroaching darkness. The high, timbered roof was lost in shadow, and the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, despair, and the faint, ever-present, metallic scent that seemed to have seeped into the very soul of the place. Parson Goodright stood at the head of the room, but he was a spectre at his own feast of despair. His shoulders were stooped, his face a parchment map of ruin, his eyes vacant pools that reflected no light. He offered no prayer, no scripture, no guidance. He was merely a witness to the final unraveling of the world he had helped to damn. It was Joseph Miller, his own body grown gaunt but his spirit hardened to a flinty resolve, who stepped into the void of leadership. His voice, though raspy from disuse and strain, carried through the frigid silence with the force of a man who has already accepted his own death. "We all know why we are here," he began, his gaze sweeping over the haunted faces. "The question is before us. That place," he jerked his head westward, "and what is in it? I will not mince words. I stand with my dead. My brother John, my daughter Lily, their remains are in that charnel house. To even consider breaking that door is to spit on their graves. To put that substance into our mouths is to become the very thing we destroyed. It is the final victory for Alaric Grimes, to make us all butchers of our own kin. I say we let it rot. I say we face the winter with clean hands and clean souls, and if God wishes to take us, then we go to him as we are, not as monsters we have made of ourselves." A murmur, thick with agreement and anguish, ran through a significant portion of the crowd. These were the purists. They were the ones who had lost most directly to the feast fever, their grief a firewall against the corrupting logic of necessity. They saw the proposed act not as survival, but as a spiritual suicide, a willing descent into a hell they had only just escaped. They clung to the idea of a moral absolute, even if that absolute was a frozen, starving death. But against this wall of principle stood the crushing, immediate reality of crying children and failing strength. Walter Higgs, a broad-shouldered man now looking shrunken in his own clothes, stepped forward to answer Miller. His face was not etched with the fine lines of grief, but with the coarse grooves of pragmatic worry. "You speak of clean souls, Joseph." Higgs's voice was low and gravelly, stripped of all ornament. "A noble sentiment. But my children's souls are housed in bodies that are failing. They cry from hunger, not from sin. What will God think of a father who lets his infants starve to death when there is food, however procured, locked away a stone's throw from his door? Grimes is dead." His sin died with him. What remains is meat. Salted, smoked meat. It has no memory. It has no soul. It is fuel. To let it molder while our families turn to skin and bone, that is the true abomination. That is a waste of the life God gave us. I will not preside over the slow death of my own blood for the sake of a principle that offers only a colder grave. His argument, brutal in its practicality, landed with the force of a sledgehammer among those who were daily watching the light fade from their loved ones' eyes. These were the pragmas. For them, the metaphysical horror of the smokehouse had been supplanted by the physical horror of the empty cradle. The concept of damnation was an abstract threat. The sight of a child's ribs showing through pale skin was a concrete emergency. The debate that followed was not a debate at all. It was the tearing apart of a community's final, frayed threads. Voices rose, cracked with emotion and weakness. "You would make us cannibals," a woman from the purist faction shrieked, her face contorted with revulsion. "And you would make my son a corpse," a pragmatist man roared back, holding up his listless, hollow-eyed boy for all to see. "Is his life worth less than your delicate feelings? It is the mark." Martha Clay's reedy voice pierced the cacophony, her finger pointing accusingly at the pragmatists. "You would not bear it on your hands, but you would ingest it. You would make it a part of you. You would carry the mark in your very bones. I'll carry my living son to the spring, and that's all that matters to me." Higgs bellowed, his patience gone. "Your high-mindedness will be the death of us all." The meeting dissolved into a chaos of shouted accusations and raw, weeping despair. There was no middle ground, no compromise to be found. The schism was absolute. Parson Goodright remained silent throughout, a monument to failed stewardship. As the arguments reached a fever pitch, Joseph Miller looked upon the pragmatists with a final, sorrowful contempt. "So be it," he said, his voice suddenly calm and terribly final. "You go your way. We will go ours. But do not think we will break bread with you at this new, hellish table. You will eat your feast alone." He turned and walked out of the barn, and a third of the village, the purists, followed him without a backward glance. They left behind a heavier silence, broken only by the ragged breaths of those who remained. The pragmatists, led by Walter Higgs, stood together in the flickering light. They had won the argument, but their faces showed no triumph, only a grim, shame-faced resolution. The village of Blackmoor Weald was no more. In its place were two warring encampments, separated by an ideological chasm as deep and cold as the grave, both staring into the same long, dark winter, but preparing to face it in ways that made them strangers to one another. The division was complete, and the path ahead forked towards two different kinds of damnation. The schism in Blackmoor Weald was no longer a matter of debate. It was a physical and spiritual partition etched into the very landscape of the village. The purists, led by the gaunt and resolute figure of Joseph Miller, withdrew into a tight-knit, silent enclave. Their cottages, clustered near the church, became fortresses of a grim piety. They barred their doors not just against the cold, but against the influence of their former neighbors. When they passed a pragmatist in the lane, they looked through them as if they were already ghosts, their silence a more potent condemnation than any curse. They embraced their chosen fate with a terrifying solemnity, their daily life reduced to a slow, ritualistic preparation for death. They conserved their minuscule stores with a fanatical precision, meting out spoonfuls of thin gruel, their prayers now focused not on deliverance, but on the strength to endure their martyrdom with grace. The pragmatists, meanwhile, occupied a different kind of hell. Their side of the village, centering on Walter Higgs's larger farmstead, hummed with a furtive, shameful energy. The decision had been made, but the act itself remained before them, a monstrous threshold they had yet to cross. The moral qualms they had suppressed in the tithe barn now returned to them in the quiet of their homes, amplified by the accusing silence from the other end of the village. They spoke in hushed tones, their conversations circling endlessly around the same terrible pivot point. They devised practical plans. They would take only what was necessary, they would burn the rest in a great pyre as a purification, they would never speak of it again. But these were mere rationalizations, fragile scaffolds built over an abyss of horror. Their hunger was now joined by a new, psychological torment, the anticipation of the sacrilege. For 3 days, a dreadful paralysis held them. They watched their children grow weaker. They saw the hollow look in each other's eyes. The locked smokehouse on the hill became an obsession, the focus of all their fear, their self-loathing, and their desperate hope. It was Walter Higgs, his own children's cries finally shredding the last of his hesitation, who broke the deadlock. On the morning of the 4th day, he emerged from his cottage with a heavy iron pry-bar in his hand. He did not speak. He simply began to walk towards the western track. One by one, the other men of the pragmatist faction, their faces set in masks of grim determination, fell into step behind him. It was a somber, funereal procession, devoid of the furious energy of the mob that had hunted Grimes. This was a colder, more calculated descent. Elias Thorne saw them from the vicarage window. A cold certainty gripped him. He could not stop them, but he could not let them cross this Rubicon alone. He had to witness it. He had to share the burden of this defining sin. He pulled on his coat and hurried after them, his heart a frantic, trapped bird in his chest. He caught up to them just as they reached the overgrown path to Grimes's hut. The men glanced at him, their expressions a mixture of shame and defiance, but no one questioned his presence. They needed a witness, even a condemning one, to validate the reality of the terrible choice they were making. The property was a scene of eerie desertion. The main hut looked deader than ever, its dark doorway like a sightless eye. The air was still, and the ever-present wisp of smoke was gone, leaving only the memory of its cloying scent. All attention was fixed on the smaller, windowless stone building. The heavy oak door, warped by weather and sealed by time, seemed to radiate a palpable malevolence. The iron latch and the stout lock, forged by Grimes's own hands, were thick with rust, as if the building itself was bleeding its age and its secrets. For a long moment, the men simply stood there, a semicircle of hesitation before the sealed tomb. The stories of the ghost in the smoke returned to them now, not as silly superstitions, but as potential warnings. Was something waiting for them inside? Was the spirit of Grimes, or the collective anguish of the dead, standing guard? Higgs, his jaw clenched, shoved the end of the pry-bar into the gap between the door and the jamb. The sound of splintering wood was shockingly loud in the silence, a violent violation that made several men flinch. He leaned his weight into it, his muscles straining. The old wood groaned in protest, a long, agonized sound that seemed to come from the very heart of the building. With a final, sickening crack, the lock tore free from its moorings, and the door swung inwards. A wave of air rolled out from the dark interior. It was cold, and carried with it a concentration of the village's signature odor so powerful it was a physical blow. The heavy, spicy aroma of juniper and sage, now utterly corrupted by the thick, greasy, sweet and sour stench of long-cured meat and the underlying, ineradicable tang of old blood and bone. It was the smell of the harvest supper, of the church, of the very curse itself, now unleashed in its pure, undiluted form. Men coughed, gagged, covered their noses and mouths with their sleeves. Higgs stepped across the threshold, his figure swallowed by the darkness. After a moment, his voice emerged, flat and hollow, stripped of all emotion. "Bring a light." A lantern was lit and passed forward. Its yellow glow pushed back the shadows, illuminating the interior in a flickering, hellish panorama. The sight within was both exactly what Elias had described and infinitely worse in its tangible, olfactory reality. The rafters were hung with the same ghastly shapes he had seen through the crack. The long, pale limbs, the split torsos, the smaller, heartbreaking forms. They were shrouded in a layer of grayish, greasy dust and glistened with a faint, smoky residue. The hooks from which they swung were thick with rust and coagulated fat. On the earthen floor, in a corner, was a pile of discarded personal effects that Grimes had not bothered to burn. A scrap of a familiar dress fabric, a child's lone, small shoe. It was this final, mundane detail that made the horror complete, that anchored the monstrous spectacle in a reality of specific, individual lives that had been erased. No one spoke. The reality of what they were contemplating, now laid bare before them, was too vast for words. The theoretical had become inescapably physical. The latch was lifted, the door was open, and the abyss was staring back at them, its breath the cold, foul air of the smokehouse, its voice the silent, swinging condemnation of the dead. The initial, visceral wave of revulsion that had frozen the men at the smokehouse threshold slowly receded, not because the horror had diminished, but because it was being steadily replaced by the older, more primal imperative that had driven them there, the gnawing, ever-present ache of hunger. The sight within the stone building was an abomination, a gallery of nightmares given form. The pale, elongated shapes hanging in the gloom were a blasphemy against nature and God. The air was a thick, cloying miasma that coated the tongue and the back of the throat with the taste of corrupted spices and ancient death. Yet, as the seconds stretched into a full, silent minute, a terrible recalibration occurred within the minds of the starving men. The monstrous was being measured against the necessary. The unthinkable was being assessed for its utility. Walter Higgs was the first to break the spell. He did not look at the others. His eyes were fixed on the ghastly inventory, his face a rigid mask. He stepped fully inside, the lantern in his hand throwing monstrous, dancing shadows that made the suspended forms seem to twitch and sway. "It's just meat," he said, his voice a low, strained thing, as if he were convincing himself as much as the others. "Cured. Smoked. It'll keep." He reached out, not towards a recognizable limb, but towards a darker, less definable mass wrapped in cheesecloth and heavily coated in herbs and salt. His hand, though calloused and strong, trembled slightly. The act of touching it, of his fingers sinking slightly into the firm, waxy surface, was a threshold in itself. He pulled it from its hook. It was heavy, dense. "We'll take this one. And that one." He pointed to another similar bundle. The other men hesitated, their feet rooted to the spot just outside the door. The psychological barrier was as formidable as the physical one. To step inside was to accept this new reality, to become a part of the smokehouse's dreadful ecosystem. "Walter," one man began, his voice choked. "My Mary, she lost her mother to the fever last year. What if that's—" Higgs turned on him, his eyes blazing in the lantern light with a desperate fury. "Do you see faces, John? Do you see your mother-in-law's smile on this? You see meat. Salted, smoked meat. It has no name. It has no past. It is fuel for the future, or there is no future. Do you want to tell your children there is no food because you were too faint of heart to take what was before you?" His words, harsh and pragmatic, were a whip. The man, John, flinched, then, with a shuddering breath that was half a sob, he stepped across the threshold. The others, one by one, followed. They moved like automatons, their movements stiff and reluctant. They did not look at each other. Their eyes were fixed on the tasks their hands performed, selecting the most anonymous-looking bundles, avoiding the shapes that were too clearly a leg or an arm, carefully, almost reverently, cutting them down from their hooks with knives that felt unclean in their hands. The silence was broken only by the rasp of steel through tough, dried sinew and the soft, heavy thud as the parcels were placed into the sacks they had brought. Elias watched from just outside, his stomach a tight, cold knot. He was a witness to a damnation more profound than any he had read of in theological texts. This was not a sin of passion or of momentary weakness. It was a cold, calculated, communal embrace of a moral void for the sake of survival. He saw the conflict on every face, the shame, the self-loathing, warring with the desperate, animal need to provide for their families. They were not monsters. They were desperate fathers and husbands, and that made their actions all the more tragic. They were bargaining their souls for a few more weeks of life for their children, and they knew the exact terrible cost. The process was slow, methodical, and utterly surreal. They worked with the grim efficiency of men unloading a cargo ship, but the cargo was the physical essence of their own neighbors. One man, younger than the others, suddenly retched, vomiting a thin, acidic bile onto the earthen floor before stumbling back outside, his face ashen. No one commented. They all understood. Higgs himself, for all his bluster, was pale, a fine sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cold. When 2 sacks were filled, Higgs held up a hand. "Enough. This will see us through, for a while." The words, "for a while," hung in the foul air, a promise of future returns to this place, an acknowledgement that this was not a one-time transgression, but the foundation of a new, horrifying normal. They filed out, the men carrying the heavy, lumpy sacks on their shoulders. They did not look back at the smokehouse. Their eyes were fixed on the ground or on the path ahead. The walk back to the village was a funeral procession for their own collective innocence. They had crossed over. They had lifted the latch, and they had taken the bargain. They were now the keepers of the secret, the inheritors of the tainted larder. The line that had separated them from Alaric Grimes had not just been blurred, it had been erased. They had become what they had destroyed, and the weight of the sacks on their shoulders was nothing compared to the weight now settling upon their souls. The desperate bargain had been struck, and the price was a knowledge that would forever poison the very act of sustenance. The return of the pragmatists from the smokehouse was not a triumphant procession of provisioners, but a furtive, shame-faced creep back into the heart of the village. The 2 heavy, lumpy sacks they carried seemed to radiate a palpable aura of corruption, a secret so heavy it bent their spines and lowered their gaze to the frozen ground. They did not go to their individual homes immediately. Instead, they gathered in the large, cold barn attached to Walter Higgs's farmstead, the doors shut and barred against the world, and against the accusing eyes of the purists who they knew were watching from behind shuttered windows. The air inside was thick with tension, the only light coming from a single lantern hung from a central beam, its flame guttering as if sickened by the proceedings. The sacks were untied and their contents laid out on a clean-swept portion of the stone floor. The anonymous, cloth-wrapped parcels lay there, inert and sinister. The spicy, smoky scent, now familiar as the smell of damnation itself, filled the confined space, overwhelming the homely smells of old hay and animals. For a long time, the men simply stood in a silent circle around them, as if performing a vigil for something that had just died, their own scruples, perhaps. The act of acquisition had been one thing. The act of preparation and consumption was another, a more intimate and final step into the abyss. It was Walter Higgs, his jaw set like granite, who finally broke the stillness. He drew a large, sharp knife from his belt, the same knife, some noted with a shudder, that had been used to cut the parcels from their hooks. With a grim, practical air that was more terrifying than any show of emotion, he began to unwrap one of the bundles. The cheesecloth, stained dark with age and seepage, fell away to reveal the contents within. It was a dense, dark, marbled mass, its original anatomy obscured by time, smoke, and salt, threaded through with the hardy herbs of the moor. It was, to a dispassionate eye, simply a large cut of cured meat. But every man present knew its provenance, and that knowledge transformed it into something unspeakable. Higgs began to slice it. The knife made a soft, tearing sound as it passed through the firm, dry flesh. The slices fell away, dark and waxy, their texture unlike any pork or beef they had ever seen. The process was conducted in a near-religious silence, broken only by the sound of the blade and the ragged breathing of the men. The slices were piled onto a wooden platter, a dark offering on pale pine. "We will eat first," Higgs announced, his voice hollow in the barn's expanse. "The men. We will test it, before we give it to our wives and children." It was a feeble attempt at chivalry, a last, desperate grasp at a moral high ground that had long since crumbled away. but it was a ritual they all clung to. They would be the pioneers in this new, terrible country, the first to damn themselves so that their families might live. One by one, they stepped forward. Each man took a slice from the platter. Their hands trembled. Some closed their eyes. Elias, who had followed them into the barn as a silent witness, felt a wave of dizziness so profound he had to steady himself against a post. He was watching the sacrament of a new anti-faith, a communion of the damned. The first man to bring the meat to his lips was a young father named Peter. His hand shook so violently he nearly dropped it. He took a small, tentative bite. The sound of his teeth meeting the dense flesh was audible in the silence. He chewed once, twice, his face a contorted mask of concentration and revulsion. Then he stopped. A strange, distant look came into his eyes. He swallowed. A collective, held breath was released. "It's salty," Peter whispered, his voice cracking. "And the herbs, it's just like it always was." His words, so mundane, so utterly inadequate to the cosmic transgression they represented, seemed to break the final barrier. The other men, emboldened by his survival, began to eat. There were no cries of pleasure, no expressions of satisfaction. They ate with the grim, functional determination of men taking a bitter medicine. They chewed and swallowed, their faces pale, their eyes avoiding contact with one another. They were consuming the physical proof of their own moral collapse. The taste was familiar. It was the rich, spicy, unmistakable flavor of Alaric Grimes's sausages, the flavor of every harvest supper, the flavor that had sustained and now cursed their village. The horror was not in a new, alien taste, but in the terrifying, intimate familiarity of it. Elias watched them, his own stomach roiling. He saw the moment each man crossed his own personal Rubicon, the moment the jaw moved, the throat convulsed, and the substance became a part of him. It was a violation more profound than any he could have imagined. They were not just eating, they were integrating the curse into their very bodies. They were making the desecration a part of their own cellular structure. The ghost in the smoke was no longer an external phantom. It was being invited inside, to take up residence in the bellies and the blood of the living. When the ritual was complete, the men stood in silence for a moment longer, the awful knowledge settling upon them. They had done it. The first, terrible bite had been taken. The line was crossed, irrevocably. They had stared into the abyss, and then they had eaten it. The hunger in their bellies was momentarily quieted, but a new, deeper, more existential hunger had been awakened in its place. A hunger for absolution that they knew, in their heart of hearts, would never, ever come. They had ensured their physical survival, but they had signed the deed of ownership for their own souls over to the darkness of the Weald. The feast was over. The damnation had begun. The consumption of the tainted meat did not bring the relief the pragmatists had so desperately hoped for. Instead of unity and purpose, a new and more subtle poison began to seep through their faction, a miasma of guilt and paranoia that was far more corrosive than the physical pangs of hunger had ever been. The act, committed in the grim shadows of the barn, did not remain a secret shared among the men. It could not. The evidence was in the cooking pots that now, for the first time in weeks, gave off a rich, meaty steam. It was in the bowls of dark, greasy stew placed before wide-eyed, grateful children and weary, suspicious wives. It was in the very air of their cottages, which now carried the unmistakable, spicy sweet scent of Alaric Grimes's secret recipe, a fragrance that had once signified community and now reeked of sacrilege. The feeding itself was a scene of profound and unsettling dissonance. The children, too young to understand the metaphysical horror, ate with the voracious appetite of the starving, their hollow cheeks regaining a touch of color, their listless eyes showing a flicker of life. It was a sight that should have brought joy to their parents' hearts, but instead it brought only a sharp, stabbing agony. Every grateful smile from a child, every contented sigh from a wife, was a twist of the knife. Their families were being nourished by a source so foul that its contemplation could unmake a mind, and their gratitude felt like a mockery of the terrible sin that provided for them. The men who had partaken first, the self-appointed vanguard of damnation, found they could not meet their families' eyes over the meal. They pushed the food around their own bowls, their stomachs churning not with hunger, but with a sickening cocktail of shame and a strange, new kind of fear. Having eaten the meat, they felt different. It was not a physical illness, but a spiritual contamination. They felt marked, as if they had taken upon themselves a visible stain that only they could see. They started at shadows, their sleep was haunted by fragmented, bloody dreams, and they felt a creeping sense of unease, a conviction that they were being watched, judged not by God or their purest neighbors, but by the very substance they had ingested. The social fabric of the pragmatist enclave, already frayed, began to tear from within. Whispers started, not about the morality of their act, but about the specifics. In the dead of night, a wife would turn to her husband, her voice a terrified whisper in the darkness. "This taste, it's so strong, so familiar. The herbs. Walter, this tastes like the stew we had after old Mrs. Miller passed. Do you remember?" Or a man, staring into the fire after supper, would mutter to his brother, "Peter said his slice was from a haunch." A haunch. John Miller, God rest him, he always had one leg that was shorter than the other from that fall. A malformed haunch. These were the seeds of a madness far more terrifying than starvation. They began to look at each other differently. The communal bond that had held them together through the decision to break into the smokehouse was replaced by a furtive, horrified speculation. When they gathered, their conversations were strained, their eyes darting towards each other's bodies with a new, grotesque curiosity. Were they eating the remains of Walter's long-dead father? Was the stew that nourished the Cooper family made from the remains of their own daughter, lost to the fever 2 winters prior? The meat, which had been anonymous in the smokehouse, was now being assigned identities in the terrified imaginations of the consumers. They were not just eating the dead, they were, in their minds, consuming specific dead, reconstructing a genealogy of horror with every bite. Elias witnessed this psychological unraveling with a feeling of helpless dread. He visited the cottages of the pragmatists, and the atmosphere within was thick with things unsaid. The women, who had not been part of the initial foray, looked at their husbands with a mixture of pity, fear, and a dawning comprehension of the price that had been paid for the food in their larder. The men were becoming hollowed out, their spirits wasting away even as their bodies were sustained. The sustenance was cursed. It filled the belly but starved the soul, feeding a new kind of fever, a fever of the conscience, a delirium of guilt that promised no recovery, only a slow, grinding descent into a hell of their own making. They had chosen life, but the life they had chosen was a waking nightmare, a perpetual feast where every mouthful was a reminder that they had sold their humanity for a full stomach and that the bill, with compound interest, was coming due. While the pragmatist faction descended into its private hell of full bellies and tormented souls, a different, more austere drama was unfolding within the purist enclave. Led by the gaunt and unyielding figure of Joseph Miller, they had embraced their fate with a solemnity that bordered on the ecstatic. Theirs was not a slow, passive wasting away. It was a deliberate, ritualized march towards the grave, a final, defiant testament to their unsullied humanity. They had barricaded themselves not just in their cottages, but in a fortress of principle, and they were determined to let its walls be their tomb. Their daily life became a strange and chilling parody of the monastic. They met each morning in the cold, dark church of St. Bartholomew the Less, not for a service led by the broken Parson Goodright, but for a silent vigil. They did not pray for deliverance, for they believed God had already presented them with their choice and they had made it. Instead, they prayed for the strength to endure the consequences. They sat in the frigid pews, their breath pluming in the air, their faces pale and skeletal in the weak light filtering through the grimy windows. The only sounds were the ragged rhythm of their breathing and the occasional dry cough that echoed in the hollow nave. They were willing their souls to remain pure, even as their bodies consumed themselves from within. Elias visited them daily, a spectral figure moving between the two damned camps. The contrast was jarring. In the pragmatist cottages, there was the clatter of pots and the low, anxious murmur of voices, the air thick with the smell of cooking and secret shame. In the purest homes, there was only a profound, chilling silence, broken by the weak cries of starving children, which were soon soothed into a listless quiet by parents whose eyes held a frightening, otherworldly resolve. They had so little food left that they had ceased to properly ration it. They were now merely prolonging the inevitable, giving their children a few spoonfuls of thin gruel or mashed turnip each day, while they themselves often took nothing. Martha Clay became the high priestess of this grim congregation. Her own long-held knowledge and refusal to partake had made her a figure of reverence among them. She moved from cottage to cottage, not with food, but with a fierce, burning certainty that was its own kind of sustenance. She would hold the hand of a fading mother and whisper, "Your soul is clean. It is a white flame. Do not let the world's darkness extinguish it. This hunger is but a moment. Paradise is eternal." Her words, fanatical and chilling, were a powerful antidote to the desperate logic of the other side. She was convincing them that starvation was not a failure, but a victory. Joseph Miller was the living embodiment of this ideal. He had lost more than anyone, and his grief had been forged into a weapon of immense spiritual strength. He was terrifying to behold. His clothes hung from his frame like rags on a scarecrow. The bones of his face were stark and prominent, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets, but they burned with a fierce, unquenchable fire. He did not begrudge the pragmatists their choice. He pitied them. He saw them as lost, weak souls who had traded an eternity of grace for a few more weeks of a corrupted, hellish existence. "They have eaten death," he said to Elias one afternoon, his voice a dry rustle from a chair by his cold hearth. His wife, Sarah, sat catatonic in the corner, a living ghost. "They think it gives them life, but it only binds them tighter to this cursed earth. They will die anyway, Reverend. But they will die heavy with sin, their spirits bogged down by the filth they have consumed. We will die light. Our souls will be free to fly to God." Elias could find no words to argue. Miller's logic was as absolute as Higgs's, a perfect, closed system that led to a single, stark conclusion. To intervene, to try to force food upon them, would be a violation of their deepest beliefs. He was merely a witness to the final act of a tragedy, watching one part of the village slowly, willingly, starve itself into a state of grace, while the other part fed itself into a state of damnation. The purists' vigil was a long, slow suicide pact, sanctified by their own unshakable faith, and their emaciated bodies were becoming living monuments to the terrible price of purity in a world that had chosen to survive at any cost. The village was now two separate realities, existing side by side, each believing the other was already residing in hell. The grim equilibrium that had held the two factions in their separate, parallel damnations could not last. The purists' vigil, for all its spiritual fortitude, was a battle against the immutable laws of biology. The body could only consume itself for so long. The end, when it came, was not a singular event, but a slow, relentless cascade. It began with the very old and the very young. Old Man Brewer, who had been a fixture outside the smithy for 40 years, simply did not wake up one morning. His daughter, herself gaunt and weak, found him cold in his bed, a faint, peaceful smile on his lips, as if he had welcomed the end. Then, the Cooper infant, who had been too weak to even cry for days, slipped away in its mother's arms, a tiny, weightless thing. The purists did not weep with the hysterical grief of the feasted. Their mourning was a quiet, solemn affair. They saw these deaths not as tragedies, but as promotions, the first of their congregation to be called home to a better, cleaner world. But the toll did not stop there. The starvation, having claimed the most vulnerable, began to work its way through the heart of the faction. A strong young woman, once known for her tireless energy, fainted drawing water from the well and never regained consciousness. A man in his prime, who had helped hunt Grimes, succumbed to a simple chill. His body no longer had the resources to fight. The bell of St. Bartholomew's, which had fallen silent after the butcher's death, began to toll again with a dreadful, monotonous regularity. One death, then two, then three in a single, brutal day. The pragmatists, from their side of the village, heard the bell and knew what it meant. The sound was a physical blow to their already burdened consciences. The triumphant, if shameful, feeling of having secured their own survival curdled into a new, more complex horror. They were living, their children were playing, their pots were full, while their former neighbors and kin were systematically dying of hunger a stone's throw away. The sight of the purest funeral processions, small, grim affairs with emaciated pallbearers struggling under the light weight of a coffin, became a daily torment. They were the living proof of the choice the pragmatists had refused to make, and their silent, skeletal presence was an accusation more powerful than any shouted curse. The psychological pressure began to tell on the pragmatists. The cursed sustenance they consumed now tasted of ash and guilt. Men who had been resolute in the barn found themselves unable to sleep, haunted by the faces of those they had once called friends. The speculative whispers about which neighbor they might be eating were now replaced by agonized debates about whether they should take a portion of their terrible bounty to the purists, even if it was refused. But the purists, under Joseph Miller's iron will, would not have accepted it. Their rejection would have been a final, humiliating judgment. The village became a study in surreal contrasts. On one side, the faint, desperate sounds of life continued, underpinned by a constant, low-grade anxiety and self-loathing. On the other, a profound and gathering silence, broken only by the tolling of the bell and the slow, shuffling steps of the dying. The two realities were separated by only a few yards of frozen earth, but the gulf between them was as wide as the chasm between heaven and hell. The final toll was not just the count of the dead, but the toll the deaths were taking on the living. Each knell was a hammer blow on the fragile sanity of the pragmatists, a reminder that their survival had been purchased with a currency of absolute despair, and that the bill was being presented not to them, but to the innocent who had held fast to their convictions. They had chosen life, but the cost was witnessing, day by day, the slow, dignified death of the village's soul. The purest enclave, which had once been a determined congregation, was now a ghost town in the making. Cottage after cottage fell silent, their occupants either dead or too weak to leave their beds. The heart of their resistance, Joseph Miller, was now a specter of his former self. He was little more than a skeleton draped in skin, his movements slow and painful, each breath a conscious, rattling effort. Yet, the fire in his sunken eyes had not been extinguished. If anything, it burned with a more fierce, concentrated intensity, fed by the sheer force of his will and the witnessing of his community's martyrdom. He had become a living icon, a symbol of their cause, and he knew his own end was the final act of their collective statement. He took to sitting on a stool outside his cottage door, wrapped in every rag he owned, facing the heart of the village. It was a deliberate, public vigil. He was a sentinel at the gate of his own mortality, a gaunt and terrible prophet silently condemning the choices of the pragmatists. His presence was a constant, unspoken sermon. The pragmatists, when forced to pass by, would quicken their steps, their eyes averted, their faces flushed with a shame so profound it was a physical heat. They could not bear to look upon him, for in his emaciated frame they saw the ghost of the path they had not taken, the purity they had sacrificed for survival. One bitterly cold afternoon, as a light snow began to dust the grim landscape, Walter Higgs approached. He carried a small, cloth-wrapped parcel. The guilt and the sight of the dying children had finally broken through his pragmatic shell. He stopped a few feet from Miller, his broad shoulders slumped, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. "Joseph," Higgs began, his voice rough. This is madness. It does not have to be this way. He held out the parcel. It is a haunch of a venison. From the moor. Take it. For Sarah's sake, if not your own. Miller's head turned slowly, his neck bones seeming to grind with the effort. His pale eyes fixed on Higgs and then on the parcel. A long, terrible silence stretched between them, broken only by the sigh of the wind. Venison, Miller repeated, his voice a dry whisper. You lie poorly, Walter Higgs. I can smell the truth of it from here. The same cloying spices. The same foul smoke. You offer me a piece of my own brother. You offer me a piece of my daughter. Higgs flinched as if struck. Joseph, I swear. Do not. The word was a crack of sudden, surprising force, a final expulsion of energy. Do not profane this moment with your lies. You come to me, your belly full of our dead, and you offer me a share of our own damnation. You think you are offering life. You are offering a leash to tie my soul to this hell you have built. He looked past Higgs, towards the pragmatist cottages. You have made your choice. You live in a world of meat and smoke. You have traded your humanity for a full belly, and you call it wisdom. We have chosen a different path. We die as men, not as ghouls. We die clean. His gaze returned to Higgs, and it was not filled with hate, but with a vast, unbearable pity. I do not condemn you, Walter. I pity you. For when your time comes, you will not have a soul left to save. It will have been digested, passed through you, and left to molder in the soil of this cursed place. Defeated and shattered, Higgs let his arm fall. The parcel dropped into the thin snow at his feet. He turned and walked away, his spirit broken not by refusal, but by the absolute, unassailable certainty in the dying man's eyes. Miller watched him go, then turned his face back towards the village, his vigil complete. He had spoken his last. There was nothing more to say. Later that evening, as the snow fell more thickly, muffling the world in a deceptive blanket of white, Elias was summoned. He entered the Miller cottage to find Joseph seated in his chair, his head bowed slightly. He had passed quietly. On his face was an expression not of pain, but of serene, final victory. In the corner, his wife Sarah, freed from her catatonia by his passing, wept silent, exhausted tears. The last stand was over. The purist's final, living testament had been extinguished. The village, now unified in its survival, was also unified in its utter spiritual defeat. The last beacon of uncompromising principle had gone out, leaving behind only the long, dark, well-fed night. The death of Joseph Miller was the death knell for Blackmoor Weald, not as a physical place, but as a community with a future. It was the final, silent capitulation. With his passing, the last vestige of organized resistance to the terrible new order crumbled. The remaining purists, their spirit broken along with their leader's body, faced a choice that was no choice at all: join the damnation or join the dead. One by one, in the days that followed, the few haggard survivors emerged from their silent cottages and shuffled, with the gait of the utterly defeated, towards the homes of the pragmatists. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their hollow eyes and outstretched, trembling hands were a plea and a confession of utter surrender. The principle they had clung to so fiercely had become an unaffordable luxury in the face of their children's imminent death. The pragmatists, themselves hollowed out by guilt, took them in. There was no triumph in this victory, only a profound, soul-sickening weariness. The village was now one again, united in a single, terrible knowledge and a shared, cursed sustenance. The food from the smokehouse, once a source of secret shame, became the open, unspoken foundation of their continued existence. They ate it because there was nothing else. They ate it to silence the crying of the children, both their own and those of their former opponents. They ate it, and with every bite, the memory of what they were doing became a little more blurred, a little more normalized, a little more dead. But the horror was not so easily assimilated. The physical strength the tainted meat provided could not heal the spiritual sickness that now infected every soul. The village became a place of the walking dead. People moved through their chores with a listless, automated air. Conversations were functional and brief, devoid of laughter or warmth. The children, though their bellies were fuller, were quiet and watchful, sensing the profound misery of their elders. The sound of the wind and the crackle of a fire were the only constants in a silence that was heavy with unspoken atrocities. The feast fever was gone, but it had been replaced by a wasting sickness of the spirit, a communal melancholy from which there was no recovery. It was Walter Higgs, the one-time champion of pragmatism, who finally voiced the unthinkable. He stood with Elias at the edge of the village, looking out at the moors, now turning green with the first stubborn hints of spring. The worst of the winter was over. The immediate threat of starvation had passed. "It's over, isn't it?" Higgs said, his voice flat. "We survived. But there's nothing left here, Reverend. Nothing but the memory of what we've done. Every stone, every tree, it knows. The very ground is poisoned with it." Elias could only nod. The victory of survival felt like the most profound defeat imaginable. The exodus did not happen all at once. It began with a single family, the Coopers, packing their meager possessions into a cart under the cover of a misty dawn and simply leaving, without a word to anyone. They could not bear to live another day on the soil that held the graves of their purest kin, or in the shadow of the smokehouse that had sustained them. Their departure was like the first stone in an avalanche. Within a week, another family left. Then another. There were no fond farewells, no promises to write. They were fugitives from their own past, desperate to put miles between themselves and the source of their shame. Walter Higgs and the remaining families lasted until the late spring, long enough to see the first new shoots of grass and to know the land would not claim them. But the land was all that was left. The community was gone. One morning, they too hitched their carts and departed, leaving the doors of their cottages swinging open, a final, silent admission that these homes were no longer habitable by any who valued their soul. Elias Thorne was among the last to go. He walked through the deserted village, a ghost in a ghost town. He stood in the empty church, the silence now absolute. He looked towards the western track, where the smokehouse stood, its door still hanging open, a dark, vacant mouth. He had come to bring light, and he was leaving with a darkness that would dwell within him forever. He turned his back on Blackmoor Weald and did not look back. Within a year, the village was as the cartographer would later find it, a collection of skeletal stones being slowly digested by the relentless moor. The story of the butcher and the terrible choice he forced upon the villagers faded into a local legend, a fireside tale to frighten children. But for those who had lived it, and for the one curate who knew the full, unvarnished truth, it was no legend. It was a cautionary tale written in blood and consumed in silence, a permanent stain on the landscape and on the human soul, a testament to the horrifying truth that some hungers, once awakened, can never be sated, and some choices can never be unmade. The Weald had been fed, and in return, it had consumed them all.